The Domestic Workers Forum from Greenpoint, here in Cape Town, the comrades are here. The comrades from SAMU.
His Excellency, the President of the Republic of South Africa, His Excellency, the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, Cabinet colleagues, the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, the 10th Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, honorable members, members of the executive committees responsible for finance, fellow South Africans, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I brought that plant with me. It is my singular honor and privilege to introduce the first budget of the 6th administration. Today I table the Division of Revenue Bill, the Appropriation Bill, the 2020 Budget Review, the 2020 Estimates of National Expenditure, and the 2020 Tax Proposals. Now, the Aloe survives and thrives when times are tough. It actually prefers less water. The previous one we had, we actually gave it too much water, and it didn't work. It needs less water. It wins even when it seems the odds are against it. Mr. President, in your State of the Nation address 2 weeks ago, you reminded us that our capacity to win is not diminished. We have it within ourselves to be the best in the world. Congratulations to Miss Universe, Zozibini Tunzi. Congratulations to the Springboks and the Proteas, who won whilst we were preparing this budget speech. Our economy has won before, and it will win again. Before democracy, our growth was pedestrian. Indeed, between 1990 and 1992, the economy contracted for 3 consecutive years. In the 15 years following democracy, economic growth averaged 3.6% a year. The gross debt to GDP ratio declined from 46% to 26%. In the 5 years from 2003 to 2008, growth averaged around 5%, and South Africa was amongst the fastest growing major economies in the world. The unemployment rate improved by 5%. Now, even after a decade of weak economic performance, South Africa still boasts deep and liquid capital markets, strong institutions, the most diversified economy on the continent of Africa, and a young population. We are part of the most vibrant continent in this world. As Pliny the Elder said, ex Africa semper aliquid novi, always something new from Africa. Winning requires hard work, focus, time, patience, and resilience. Achieving economic growth and higher employment levels requires a plan. To quote 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win, unquote. Amen. What are the conditions under which we must implement our plan to win? In 2020, global economic growth is expected to strengthen to 3.3%. Global inflation remains contained, Global monetary policy is supportive, and we are benefiting from demand for emerging market assets. Asia, excluding Japan, is expected to grow by 5.8% in 2020. The virus which has plagued China is a source of uncertainty as it spreads around the world. With growth of 3.5%, Sub-Saharan Africa is forecast to be the second fastest growing region in the world. Against this backdrop, we forecast that the South African economy will grow by 0.9% and inflation will average 4.5% in 2020. Over the next 18 months, the economy should get a number of jump starts. These include, amongst others, firstly, the fruits of the structural reform agenda led by the President. Second, lower inflation. Third, the interest rate reductions earlier this year. Fourth, the recent gains in platinum group metals prices. Five, the impending change to the electricity regulatory framework. And six, the tax proposals we are setting out today. Persistent electricity problems will, however, hold back growth. Over the next 3 years, we expect growth to average just over 1%. Therefore, a stable supply of electricity will be our #1 critical task. Last year, the government embraced the ideas contained in the document towards an economic strategy for South Africa. This is our guiding plan. It contains the basic and fundamental pillars of our approach: strengthening the macroeconomic framework to deliver certainty, transparency and lower borrowing costs, focusing spending on education, health and social development, modernizing network industries and restructuring our state-owned enterprises, opening markets to trade with the rest of the continent, implementing the reimagined industrial strategy. Minister Patel, I thought you'd clap, man. Lowering the cost of doing business, focusing on job-creating sectors such as agriculture and tourism. Goodbye. Underpinning all of this is the need for an efficient and capable state. We must also leverage the private sector as far as possible. Today we report on our progress. We are moving forward. A sound macroeconomic framework always lays the foundation for growth. Budgets are complex, but the numbers are quite simple. The numbers show that we have a lot of work to do. For 2020-21, revenue is projected to be 1.58 trillion rand, or 29.2% of GDP. Expenditure is projected at 1.95 trillion rand, or 36% of GDP. This means a consolidated budget deficit of 370.5 billion rand, or 6.8% of GDP in 2020-2021. Gross national debt is projected to be 3.56 trillion rand, or 65.6% of GDP by the end of 2020-21. To support growth, therefore, we propose no major tax increases. I don't know where people who talked about VAT increase got that from. Indeed, there is some real personal income relief. This budget means that a teacher who earns on average 460,000 rand a year will see their taxes reduced by nearly 3,400 rand a year. Hard-working, tax-paying South Africans who earn on average 265,000 rand a year will see their income tax reduced by over 1,500 a year. Our income tax system is progressive, and the adjustments reflect this. Someone, for example, earning 10,000 rand a month will pay 10% less in tax. Someone earning 100,000 rand a month will pay about 1.5% less. We're also proposing broadening the corporate income tax base. This additional revenue will be used to reduce the corporate tax rate in the near future to help our businesses to grow. Startups will ignite the economy. The tax system supports this in a number of ways, including a preferential small business tax regime, the VAT registration threshold, and the turnover tax. We'll review this to improve their effectiveness, whilst at the same time reducing the scope for fraud and abuse. Sometimes we're afraid to take bold measures because we say there will be abuse and fraud. But in actual fact, if we want to grab the animal by the scruff of its neck, we must be bold and take chances sometimes to win and not to fail. To support the property market, the threshold for transfer duties is hereby adjusted. Property costing 1 million rand or less will no longer be subject to transfer duties. I see you're about to buy that, yes. There will be a renewed focus on illicit and criminal activity, including non-compliance by some religious public benefit organizations. Religious bodies must operate within the strict boundaries of the law if they are to enjoy any tax-exempt status. The annual tax-free savings account contributions limit rises to 36,000 rand. We have increased excise duties to keep pace with the inflation. From today, a 340 milliliter can of beer or cider will cost only an extra 8 cents. Only. A 750 milliliter bottle of wine will cost only an extra 14 cents. A 750 milliliter bottle of sparkling wine, Minister Mbalula, will only cost an extra 61 cents. A bottle of 750 milliliter spirits, including whiskey, gin, or vodka, will rise by 2.89 rand. A packet of 20 cigarettes a packet of 20 cigarettes, irrespective of the nice smile the Deputy President is giving me, will be an extra 74 cents. A 25 gram of piped tobacco, with due respect to some retired people, will cost 40 cents more. A 23-gram cigar will cost an extra 6.73 rand. I'm happy again to report to this House that there is no increase in the price of sorghum beer. In line with the Department of Health policy, we'll start taxing heated tobacco products. For example, Hubbly, Bubbly. The rate will be set at 75% of the rate of cigarettes. Electronic cigarettes, or so-called vapes, will be taxed from 2021. To adjust for inflation, the fuel levy goes up by 25 cents per liter, of which 16 cents is for the general fuel levy and 9 cents is for the road accident fund. Despite this increase, the liabilities of the road accident fund are forecast to exceed 600 billion rand by 2022-23. We need to take urgent steps to reduce this risk to the fiscus and bring about a more equitable way of sharing these costs. One option is to introduce compulsory third-party insurance, and we should debate this as quickly as possible. The carbon tax and other measures will help green the economy and will bring in 1.75 billion rand over the next few months. This will be complemented by more focused spending on climate change mitigation. We remain extremely concerned about plastic bags throughout the length and breadth of our country. In this regard, we have increased the plastic bag levy to 25 cents. Madam Speaker, our measures will support growth, but fiscal sustainability must be uppermost in our mind. Our aloe ferox can withstand the long dry season because it is unsentimental. Let me repeat this. Our aloe ferox plant can withstand the long dry season because it is unsentimental. It shares dead weight in order to direct increasingly scarce resources to what is young and vital. Total consolidated government spending is expected to grow at an average annual rate of 5.1%, from 1.9 trillion rand in 2020-21 to 2.14 trillion rand in 2022-23. This is mainly due to mounting debt service costs. Non-interest spending declines on average over the medium-term expenditure framework in real terms. As a major step towards fiscal sustainability, today we announce a net downward adjustment to main budget non-interest expenditure of 156.1 billion rand over the next 3 years, relative to the 2019 budget projections. The total reduction is mainly the result of lowering program baselines and the wage bill by 261 billion rand. These are partially offset by additions and relocations of 111 billion rand. Of this, more than half of 60 billion rand is for Eskom and South African Airways. Let me unpack the 261 billion in baseline spending reductions. The first part is adjustment on program spending of about 100 billion rand. Some of these were announced in the medium-term budget policy statement. Adjustments are mainly in conditional grants for provinces and municipalities. For human settlements, adjustment amount to 14.6 billion rand over the MTF. There are also adjustments of 2.8 billion to the municipal infrastructure grants. Over the 3 years, public transport spending is adjusted by 13.2 billion, mainly on allocations to the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa and the Public Transport Network grant. The planning and implementation of the integrated public transport networks will consequently be suspended in Buffalo City, Mbombela, and Msunduzi municipalities. Education infrastructure allocations are adjusted by 5.2 billion rand over the medium term, while health is adjusted by 3.9 billion over the same period. With some of these savings, while some of these savings are good for the fiscus, in many cases, we're also making difficult and painful political sacrifices. It is therefore important that we direct our constrained resources to areas that have a high social impact and have the largest economic multipliers. We shall undertake spending reviews to ensure that we achieve these objectives. The second part is adjustments on the wage bill by about 160 billion rand over the medium term. Public servants do crucial work for our country, often unappreciated, in difficult conditions. The governing party is a firm believer in the critical role of the state in development. For this reason, we need qualified, motivated, and effective staff members. Working with the public sector unions, we have over the past 15 years sought to improve the lot of public servants. And we have committed significant resources for compensating them every year, even as we have tried to increase their numbers in recognition of their demanding workloads. Between 2006 and 7 and 2011 and 12, we were able to add about 190,000 employees to the public service. However, at the same time, the government wages also increased quite significantly. To balance the books, which is the job of the Minister of Finance, to balance the books, we slowed hiring, and since 2011, 2012, the number of government employees has actually declined. Madam Speaker, we cannot go on like this. Classroom sizes are growing, hospitals are getting fuller, and our communities are becoming increasingly unsafe. Once we get the wage growth under control, we get corruption under control, we get wasteful expenditure under control, we will focus on what we need to focus on. Hiring in important areas such as education, the police, and healthcare. We can hire strategically and better match skill and opportunity. The employer has tabled an agenda item on the management of the Public Service Wage Bill at the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council. The focus is to discuss and negotiate the containment of costs in the final phase of implementation of the current wage agreement. We aim to save 37.8 billion rand in the next financial year. There's more than one way in which this goal can be achieved. Organized labor understands where we are and share the pains of this government. They have made constructive proposals on a range of issues which need to be discussed and negotiated. We must be open to negotiations and discussions. Mr. President, you have directed that your government should deal with wasteful expenditure. This is a vital step in restoring the confidence of the public in the government. We must get more value for our money. The President's instruction requires a dynamic and an appropriate mix of quantity, quality, capacity, and capability in the administration of the state. We are moving forward with reforms to the procurement system with a focus on value for money and maximizing the quality and quantity of services. Cabinet has approved the publication of a new procurement bill for public comment. We will accelerate merging and consolidating public entities. We will propose a new law to stop excessive salaries in public entities. We must also deal decisively with the excessively high cost of leasing government buildings. We are already acting on fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Last year, this House amended the Public Audit Act to empower the Auditor General to, 1, refer matters to a public body for investigation and prosecution, 2, take binding remedial actions, 3, recover money directly from the responsible culprits. To show the determination of the executive to deal with runaway costs, we will implement a number of steps. This includes, 1, abolishing the current wasteful subsistence and travel system. 2, replacing the exorbitant transversal cell phone contracts. 3, requiring economy class travel for all domestic flights except in exceptional circumstances of health or otherwise. So Minister Pando, Mr. President, has been very helpful through this process, and she wrote me a very nice contribution to this section. And she's providing phenomenal leadership in building a better Africa and a better world. Her work is unlocking massive value for money from South Africa's overseas missions by, amongst others, closing and merging some missions, downgrading the level of representation, reducing the number of officials who are posted to these missions, and will be establishing a fully fledged diplomatic academy. Now, the twin of our fiscal framework is an appropriate monetary policy framework. Regular consultation on fiscal and monetary policy is critical to the sustainability of our fiscal accounts, to the balanced growth of the economy, and to protecting the welfare of our people. We'd like to reiterate the current inflation target band of 6 to 3% stays as the most appropriate monetary policy framework for a country like ours. In line with that target, the moderate inflation outcomes for 2019 of 4.1% and the forecast for inflation to be around 4.5% over the next few years has helped to lower the cost of capital to firms, households, and the public sector. The South African Reserve Bank will continue to undertake its duties in line with Section 224 of the Constitution, which is to perform its functions independently without fear, favor, or prejudice in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth of the Republic of South Africa. Now, Madam Speaker, for Alloferox to grow to its full potential, we need to do things that will help it in the medium to long term. For example, augmenting the soil with the right amount of organic manure, providing the right amount of sun and the correct amount of water. For a fast-growing economy, we need to make sure that our children are well educated, all our children, black and white. Our people are healthy, and our money is invested properly. Consequently, the largest spending areas will be learning and culture, which receives 396 billion rand, followed by health, 230 billion rand, and social development, 310 billion rand. In the education sector, investment goes to new schools, replacing old schools which were constructed with inappropriate material, that means mud schools, and providing them with water, electricity, and sanitation. In 2020-21, the Math, Science, and Technology grant will introduce coding and robotics to learners in grades R to 3, as announced by the President. Transfers to provinces support schooling for 13 million children and healthcare for 49.1 million South Africans. It is in this context that taking forward the consultations on the national health insurance is very, very important. The President has been elected chairperson of the African Union for this year. We need to support his work and prove that South Africa is fully behind the African Union agenda. There is a decision of the African Union to establish a Pan-African University, and that the Space Sciences Institute will be located at the South African University. We therefore can announce today that this Space Sciences Institute will be located at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology and that funding will be made available immediately, and the consultations process will take place with the relevant ministers. Dr. Nzimande. The Department of Higher Education and Training will reallocate existing funds to undertake a feasibility study for the establishment of a new University of Science and Innovation in Ekurhuleni, as announced by the President. Over the next 3 years, 48.2% of nationally raised funds are allocated to national government, 43% to provincial government, and 8.8% to local government. 500 million rand has been provisionally set aside for disaster management to respond to the impact of recent floods and the ongoing drought. Honorable members, Funani Kwivilu from Limpopo told us that, I quote, infrastructure development should be a priority for the government, and we agree. In fact, capital spending is the fastest growing component of non-interest spending. The spending is complemented by the infrastructure fund. Over the next 3 years, the Development Bank of Southern Africa will package blended finance mega projects of at least 200 billion rand. Government has committed 10 billion rand over the next 3 years in this regard. The public can now find information on infrastructure projects on the portal Vuleka Mali, the internet portal. When you go into it, you click into it, it tells you everything else about what is happening, and you get information directly from that portal. 8.2 million young people between the ages of 15 and 34 are not in education, not in employment or training. Government is committed to helping them. Raising skills and improving the matching of young people and jobs is an important focus of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. To date, the Jobs Fund projects have created approximately 175,000 permanent jobs and helped 21,000 people into internships and created 59,900 short-term jobs in South Africa. In South Africa. Of these, 65% went to the youth. As the President announced, we will reprioritize resources to raise spending on this critical issue. We'll start work immediately, Mr. President, and I will provide more details in the 2020 medium-term budget statement. We intend to make this intervention a resounding success, for we cannot fail our youth. We are a caring society. We are a caring government. More than 18 million South Africans receive a grant of one sort or another, which is a lifeline for many. Grants reduce inequality and protect the most vulnerable in our society. I'm happy to announce that grants are adjusted as follows. Firstly, 80 rand increase for old age, disability and care dependency, which goes up to 1,860 per month. 80 rand increase in the War Veterans Grant to 1,880 rand. 40 rand increase for the Foster Care Grant to 1,040 rand per month. The Child Support Grant will increase by 20 rand to 445 per month. Changing the way we provide social grants will generate many savings in our economy and budget, which will be partly used to raise the daily subsidy per child. Madam Speaker, the next component of our plan is to modernize network industries and restructure state-owned enterprises. Government will, in quotes, do whatever it takes, unquote, to ensure a stable electricity supply. As I said, it is our #1 task. We have allocated 230 billion rand over the next 10 years to achieve the restructuring of the electricity sector. The current electricity shortfall will ease as Eskom completes critical maintenance work that they're doing. Bid window 4 of the renewable energy program is being accelerated. The rapid decline in renewable energy prices will give a new impetus momentum to bid window 5. Determinations to implement the integrated resource plan of 2019 are finished and await the concurrence of the National Energy Regulator. It will shortly be possible for municipalities in financially good standing positions to purchase electricity from independent power producers. Mr. President, the South African Airways sword of Damocles has fallen on us. SAA has been placed under business rescue, which will lead to a radically restructured airline. Over the medium term, government has allocated 16.4 billion rand to settle guaranteed debt and interest. The associated restructuring costs will be reprioritized within the budget. It is the very sincere hope of many that this intervention will lead to a sustainable airline that is not a burden to the fiscus. Cabinet approved the economic regulation of transport bill in November, which takes us forward to a fairer process for third-party access into the rail network. In 2019, South Africa signed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which comes into force on the 1st of July 2020. This agreement will open up new markets, promote regional integration, and contribute to economic growth. Today, we announce complementary measures to make it easier to do cross-border financial transactions, which will support trade and investment. We want to encourage South Africans abroad to keep their ties with their home country. We will raise the exempt amount for foreign remuneration to 1.25 million rand. We will phase out the administratively burdensome and cumbersome process of emigration through the South African Reserve Bank. Yes. Yeah, that's a good idea. Why didn't I think about that? We intend to implement the reimagined industrial strategy. An innovation fund will be capitalized with 1.2 billion rand over the next 3 years. Industrial business incentives worth 18.5 billion rand will create and retain approximately 57,000 jobs. An additional 107 million rand is reprioritized for the refurbishment of the 27 industrial parks we've spoken about before in townships and rural economies. 6.4 billion rand is allocated for small business incentive programs, of which 2.2 billion will be transferred to the Small Enterprise Development Agency. Together with the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, we are considering various proposals from ITEC related to scrap metal and poultry. Madam Speaker, steps are being taken to address South Africa's lagging productivity growth and reduce the cost of doing business. For example, the BEES portal will provide a streamlined way to register a new business with the CIPC, SARS, UIF, and the Competition Fund in one day. And that's happening already. The Competition Amendment Act came into force in July 2019, strengthening the Competition Commission's powers. The Commission has conducted inquiries into a number of sectors to strengthen competition. South Africa is moving on with the fourth industrial revolution. We are determined not to be left behind. We are relaxing regulations to help our flourishing fintech sector. The Spectrum licensing plan was released in November last year, preparing the way for auctioning high-demand spectrum. ICASA will be appropriately capacitated for this purpose. A voucher system will be introduced to allow households to acquire digital devices. Over the medium term, we'll support agriculture and tourism. Government has allocated 495.1 million rand to the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development to improve compliance with biosecurity and the support for exports. Oh, you didn't get that. It means to avoid animal diseases. It's biosecurity. An additional 500 million rand is reprioritized over the medium term for the department to finalize land claims. To support tourism, we'll engage with the tourism industry on how we can formalize the tourism levy, not tax, Minister, the tourism levy. Madam Speaker, fighting corruption is a priority of this administration, and there is no doubt about that. The NPA, the Special Investigating Unit, and the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation are allocated an additional 2.4 billion rand in this budget. This will enable the appointment of approximately 800 investigators and 277 prosecutors who will assist with, amongst others, the clearing of the backlogs of cases such as those emanating from the Zondo Commission. The disruptive actions of those, listen carefully, the disruptive actions of those who storm construction sites or mines harm growth and lead to job losses. Communities should expose such people to allow Minister Kele and Minister Lamula to ensure that the law takes its course. I hope all South Africans will join us in condemning this act of banditry. Working with the financial sector, a pilot of the Help to Buy scheme has supported over 2,000 families to buy their own homes. For every one subsidy provided by government, the scheme crowds in 8 rand from the private sector. In a single year, the Help to Buy scheme was supported by nearly 1 billion rand in new lending. Last year, this House passed legislation which allows state-owned enterprises to apply for banking licenses. In July 2019, I tasked the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. Masondo, with the responsibility to undertake the work towards the creation of a state bank. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to inform the House that we now have preferred options for the establishment of a state bank, and we are ready to move now. The architecture will be that of a retail bank operating on commercial principles. The state bank will be subject to the Banks Act and will have an appropriate capital structure and performance parameters on investments and loan impairments. It will be regulated by the Prudential Authority on its own merits. We will also consolidate the currently fragmented system of national, provincial, and local finance institutions. Mr. President, a sovereign wealth fund is an important long-term tool for saving and investment for future generations. It can also contribute to strengthening the fiscal framework. We must learn to save during the good times. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund can play an important role as a counter-cyclical fiscal tool. Today, we announced the formation of the South African Sovereign Wealth Fund with a capital injection of 30 billion rand, which easily converts to about $2 billion US. Given the legal, administrative, and procedural issues involved, a relevant bill will be submitted before this House during the course of this Parliament. There are a variety of possible funding sources for this, such as proceeds from the spectrum allocation, petroleum, gas, and minerals rights royalties, the sale of non-core state assets, future fiscal surpluses, and money set aside for this purpose. This will ensure that we continue to invest in future generations in a fiscally prudent manner. The National Development Plan calls for a capable and efficient state that creates the right environment for the private sector to flourish. Taxpayers deserve to feel that their money is going to a government that's efficient and capable. We thank all South Africans who continue paying for their taxes. SARS is an integral part of the capable state. We are focused on re-establishing the institutional integrity and fighting criminality. Just this past week, 2 individuals were convicted for up to 168 years imprisonment for tax fraud. For all South Africans, the state is their local municipality. Allocations to government, to local government. Oh, cheers. Yeah. Allocation to local government help municipalities provide basic services and are a powerful redistribution tool. Mr. President, the National Treasury asks members of the public to provide tips to guide our thinking as we shaped this budget. Today, we're joined by Ms. Akona Mwele from Gauteng, who advised us, I quote, support greater local economic development in municipalities, unquote. And we agree with her. I'm therefore pleased to announce that local government is allocated 426 billion rand from nationally raised funds over the MTF. The Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs and I have agreed that our officials will find a way to use the allocations through the municipal infrastructure grant to ensure that municipalities not only build infrastructure, but also maintain the infrastructure they already have. What this means is that instead of saying a municipality has not spent a particular allocation and therefore we take it back, we should ensure at national level that expenditure does take place, investment does take place, because unfortunately the people don't move to national. They stay in the locality and they deserve the services that they need. Now, the President spoke about the need for smart cities. So, as part of preparing this submission, Mr. President, we took a basic look around and said, where are these smart cities going to be? So it turns out that the OR Tambo International Airport, Aerotropolis in Ekurhuleni, is actually at an advanced stage of implementation. It's at an advanced stage of implementation. And King Shaka Airport in eThekwini is progressing well in that direction. The Cape Town shall soon join them in this regard. Meanwhile, Lanseria has been identified as a potential smart city. So we are proceeding in this regard. We must support this Aerotropolis. plural. Provinces provide health care and education are at the front line of service delivery. I wish to thank my colleagues in the provinces, the MECs, for finance, for the work they're doing and the inputs they make on a regular basis, and for sharing the difficulties with us as we go along. And I must really fully appreciate the contribution of Team Finance in this regard. Madam Speaker, there are a number of entities that report to the Ministry of Finance. The report of the Commission of Inquiry into the PIC highlights, amongst others, important lessons for us, including the need to implement and adhere to governance and financial controls and to reduce risk, particularly the risk appetite. The House has passed legislation to strengthen the independent regulatory board for auditors, and further legislation is planned. We'll shortly appoint an independent panel of experts to review the practices and traditions of the auditing profession, because the profession has let us down. The country's money laundering system is currently undergoing a peer review, which will help strengthen the fight against illegitimate and illegal flows. The South African Reserve Bank will in future play a more integral part in this fight. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority has repositioned itself as a market conduct regulator and will shortly appoint a new commissioner. The National Treasury will take steps to strengthen the budget process. And since it's now agreed that the budget process should ideally start after the first Lekgotla in June to provide the political leadership, is very important in this step. So winning is not easy, Madam Speaker, Mr. President. Less than 2 years before winning the World Cup, the Springboks were trounced 57-0 by the All Blacks. Miss Universe, our Miss Universe, did not win her first attempt at Miss South Africa. Winning takes patience, prudence, perseverance, and focus. As St. Paul tells us, we must run in such a way that we may win. To paraphrase Charles Dickens, who I quoted in my first address to this House, we will make this the best of times. Mr. President, Deputy President, thank you for your leadership. A word of appreciation to the Deputy Minister of Finance, the National Treasurer General of Finance and his team. My thanks to the SARS Commissioner, to the 10th Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, because I'm the 8th Governor, to colleagues in Cabinet and the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. I really thank you very much. My gratitude goes as well to the parliamentary committees who worked tirelessly to process the legislation accompanying the speech. I close by reflecting on the words of Advocate Bram Fisher, who said from the dock, and I quote, "With confidence, we lay our case before the whole world. Whether we win or we die, freedom will rise in Africa like the sun from the morning clouds." I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Point of order.
There is a point of order, Memazon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise on point 92.1, read together with Rule 78.1. And in terms of the Powers and Privileges Act, specifically Chapter 3.7c, which says that a person may not threaten or obstruct a member proceeding to or leaving from a meeting of Parliament or a House committee. Speaker, I'm terribly sorry to have to inform this House that various members of the opposition, including the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, were stopped from entering the precinct, and that's why the Honourable Steenhuisen arrived a little bit late for the speech, because the police would not allow him to...
No. Please proceed, ma'am.
Speaker, the police would not allow Honourable Steenhuisen to enter the precinct with his parliamentary member's gold card, and he was required to produce an ID document which he didn't have on hand. The same thing happened to Honourable Tsepo Matlongo, and various other members of the opposition were stopped from entering the precinct. Now, Madam Speaker, the safety and the access of the precinct lies within your office. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to investigate why the South African Police Service deliberately obstructed a member from entering the precinct and thus breaking a rule and creating an illegal act in terms of the Powers and Privileges Act and bringing your good office into disrepute.
Thank you, ma'am.
Speaker.
Order, members. Allow me to rule on this motion.
We just want to affirm, Honourable Speaker, that there is terrible over-securitization of Parliament, and there is targeted searching of honourable members in our own precinct. It is a serious interference in a different and separate arm of the state by the executive. The police are not under our orders, they are not under our control. They are under the control of the executive. Them treating us like that amounts to intimidation of members of Parliament and a direct violation of the Constitution.
Thank you, member.
Please, they must stand down, or we must form our own parliamentary security order and harass them back.
Honourable Ndlozi.
Otherwise, we're going to defy
Honourable Ndlozi, you made your point. Order, members. Order. Honourable members, order. Member Zoni is within the rules to stand up on a matter of privilege. Honourable members, I will investigate the matter and I will report back. Thank you very much. The papers tabled by the Minister will be referred to the relevant committees. This concludes the business of the day. This House is adjourned.
All right, well, the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, has concluded his budget speech. Lots of surprises, actually. No major tax increases on personal income tax, corporate income tax, and, of course, VAT. That's a wonderful thing, of course. Of course, we are going to have to pay more in terms of sin taxes. That was inevitable. We're going to be paying more in terms of the road fuel levy, and we're also going to be paying a levy for the road accident fund. These were inevitable and they were likely to come up. Of course, the big surprise is that government is going to be cutting 156 billion rand off its non-interest expenditure that is on the essentials, you know, your education, health, police, security, etc. They're going to be cutting that amount of money over the next 3 years, and this is due in part to some of the pressure that they've been under in terms of sorting out SOEs. But anyway, I understand that my colleague Manelisi Dubasi does have a guest with him to get some political reaction from the Finance Minister's speech. Let's cross over to him.
Yes, I have Mr. Steve Swart from the ACDP. Mr. Swart, thank you very much for coming. Your take on the Minister's speech?
Well, I think there were a number of positives to take from the speech as well as a number of negatives. Obviously, the positives that one does see is that there was no increase in personal taxes, no increase in VAT. But then on the negative side, we do see the budget deficit increasing to 6.8%. And of course, the government debt levels increasing significantly, which will result in 229 billion rand being spent on government debt service costs. So that needs to be addressed. From our side, the ACDP, we've long been saying, give the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks and the Asset Forfeiture Unit additional funds. There's 2.4 billion rand additional funds to lock away people involved in corruption and to recover the ill-gotten gains. That we welcome very much. Obviously, the whole wage bill is going to be very interesting. Whilst we welcome the 160 1.8 billion saving in that regard. It's going to take some negotiation. It's going to take some sacrifice. We are, at the end of the day, very concerned about the long-term fiscal sustainability of our debt, and that needs to be stabilized.
Mr. Swart, thank you very much for your time. That Mr. Steve Swart from the ACDP. I guess my colleague Bulelane is having another guest, and we cross over to Bulelane.
Well, we're continuing to take political reactions right here in front of the National Assembly. Of course, now joining me is the DA spokesperson on finance, Jordan Hill-Lewis. A lot of things that the finance minister has said, of course, issues of growth still under 1%, as well as revising downwards the budget. Your take on this?
The Minister has made the right decision by prioritising growth as his number one focus, and that's why there's been no tax increases and in fact a little bit of tax decreases for personal income tax. That's good news, that's pro-growth, and that's helpful to the economy. It's also good news that he's focusing on cutting the public wage bill. However, we must stress that those numbers still need to be negotiated with the public sector unions themselves, so we can't take them as a given. I think it was a little bit irresponsible of the Minister to include them in the budget when they haven't been negotiated yet. But overall, given that the Minister has got very little moving room, I think he's done the best that he can to try and get the economy growing today and try and return some money back to people's pockets. And for that reason, we welcome it. We just are a little bit concerned about those public wage figures, that they are not credible.
He's talked about consolidating public entities, also about 60 billion for Eskom and SAA. Of course, the issue of SOEs is still the elephant in the room.
Yeah, I'm afraid that is the one piece of bad news, another big 16 billion rand bailout for SAA. That's just not acceptable. We keep prioritizing these failing zombie state-owned entities over the basic services that the public really needs, and that is not a good choice. We're very sad to see that he's again given money to SAA. Again, we say, just sell it. The state should not own an airline.
All right, thank you so much. Jordan Hill-Lewis, he's the spokesperson of the DA for Finance. Nompu will cross back to you in studio.
Thanks very much for that, Bulelani. Of course, I'm joined in studio by Busisiwe Khadebe. She's an economist at Nedbank. Thanks very much for joining us.
Lovely to have me.
Good stuff. So that surprise, no major increases on, personal income tax, corporate tax, VAT. Of course, some within your ilk were suggesting maybe we'd get an extra VAT increase. Were you surprised?
I wasn't surprised at all. I mean, the economy is not doing that great. If you look at how sort of tax revenues have underperformed over the last couple of years, you can't now all of a sudden expect something great to happen there. So I wasn't surprised at all. What I was probably surprised about was, on the other side of things, what they were doing with expenditure and how sort of deep the cut was and where they were going to get most of that money they were cutting from. So those were the big sort of surprises, but not so much on the revenue side, because you can't really they were trying to get blood from a stone, so you wouldn't really expect that to happen. So you expected some of that tax relief that you saw, but on the other side, the expenditure one is what I was surprised by.
Of course, on the expenditure side, they're looking to cut about 156 billion rand over the next 3 fiscal years. That's quite hectic indeed. What is that going to mean for things like service delivery?
I mean, the bulk of it actually comes from the public sector wage bill. So if you look at if it's teachers, if it's whatever they're going to do of that bulk, so it does mean probably it's not going to be as lovely if they're going to cut from teachers or things like that, but we have to see what they're going to do. So if you look at education and we say we're spending a lot on education, the bulk of that are those salaries they're doing. So they may be trying to, over the medium term, in real terms, slightly increase that, decrease that, so decrease the amount on that, but I don't think, we'll see how it actually plays out. I don't think it's that a big deal, because I think when you look in the past, they usually used to say, you know what, we're going to increase the wage bill by inflation +1, and then when we get sort of to the next year, it was way more than that, because they were looking at things like uniform allowance and night shift allowance, and that was blowing things up, and where they're trying to cut, it was some of that it was coming through. It was pay progression and some of those extra benefits that they were looking at that we actually expected them to do in the past and they didn't do in the past, so that's what they're looking at. as well.
One of the people that my colleagues just interviewed on the steps just now, a politician, said, I think he's from the DA, said he thinks it's rather irresponsible for them to factor in those numbers, those cuts, because it's mainly coming from the public sector wage deals when they haven't actually begun to negotiate. Your thoughts?
I mean, they're going to have to. Maybe there is an agreement with unions already. I don't think they'll just come out there and just say, this is what we're doing, and they're going to unilaterally decide that's what they're going to do. I think there must have been a conversation somehow. There's still a year left over of sort of the multiple sort of agreement they've got, so they're going to have a look at that. But I don't think they would unilaterally do that. There must have been a conversation.
Let's wait and see. We're going to continue our conversation, but we're just going to cross very quickly to Manalise, who's got Mr. Mkwankwa with him.
Thank you very much, Nompu. Yes, we have Nabayum Zinkwankwa from the UDM. Mr. Kwankwa, your take on the minister's speech?
Well, firstly, I think we think that the minister did a good job or great job walking on a tightrope, but the bottom line is there's no growth strategy in that speech. It was a matter of the minister and his government trying to do damage control and managing this terrible situation the best they can. But from where we're sitting is that their priorities are a bit lopsided. For an example, you have a government that is going to give 16.4 billion rands to SAA over the medium term. That very same government only gives 2.2 billion rands to small businesses, which are important in reigniting growth. This country, for an example, as we stand now, we spend more money, more than 200 billion rands on debt service costs than we do on community development and economic development and other critical programs that would help us to reignite growth. The other aspect is that we obviously welcome the minister's decision to say some of the benefits and perks, including the salaries of SOE workers, need to be reduced significantly because that is where a lot of wastage takes place. He mentioned corruption in passing. He did not, like as was the case with the president, he didn't say anything concrete about what they intend doing about those who continue to loot state resources. It's concerning for us, for example, to say even the saving that is going to be made from the public sector wage bill will only be channeled towards SOEs like ESCOM and SAA and another wasteful expenditure that is taking place in the system, rather than putting some of those resources, once that important political balancing act and negotiation has been done with unions, to say how can we use those resources to reignite growth so that in the medium to long term we're able to employ more people in the sector once the economy grows properly.
Thank you very much for your time. That's the spokesperson of the UDM for finance, and it's back to my colleague, Bulelane.
Well, thank you so much, Manelis. Of course, continuing to take political reactions outside here of the Parliament. Bringing into the conversation now Dr. Pieter Groenewald, the leader of the FF+. Of course, it's a wide-ranging issues that we could talk about, but of course, one of the issues we've talked about in the past is the issue of fighting corruption. Did the minister allocate enough resources for that fight?
Well, he allocated a couple of million, 100 million or so for the NPA and those structures to look at the corruption in South Africa, especially coming from the Zondo Commission. I'm not so sure whether that is enough. They said they're going to appoint about 500 investigators also to investigate, but I don't think that is enough. But I think the main thing is that everybody is relieved that personal tax and VAT has not been increased. The fact of the matter is still that if you look at the deficit, the budget deficit is already 6.5%, and it can increase to 6.8%. If you look at the gross debt situation of the government, it increases to 356 trillion, which is about 65.8% of the GDP. That is quite worrying. And we must also remember that there is a fuel levy of 25 cents per litre increase, which will be an effect on each and every consumer. Also the SOEs. ESCOM is receiving about 65 billion. And what worries the Freedom Front Plus is that the door to the government employees pension fund has not been closed. In fact, the minister said they will do everything to ensure that ESCOM survive and produce electricity. So that is worrying.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Pieter Groenewald, the leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Nombu, it's back to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. So we continue our conversation with Busisiwe Radebe of Nedbank. Thanks again for joining us. So let's talk about the debt trajectory. So Tito Mboweni came out to say that for this fiscal year, our consolidated budget deficit is going to be sitting at 6.8% of GDP, and our gross national debt is going to be reaching about 3.56 trillion rand, which is 65.6% of GDP. Are these numbers going to be palatable to the ratings agencies?
I mean, if you look at it, you want to think of it a sustainable level of sort of debt to GDP, and usually that is around that 60% mark. So we're over that in the medium term. We probably, I think, we're getting to about 71.6% of GDP. So it is over that mark, but debt is not all bad. It must be sort of what you're spending on the debt that you need to actually have a look at. And that's, I think, where we have gone slightly wrong. When we look at sort of current expenditure, a lot of that money has gone to go spend on current expenditure, and that's where we have gone wrong. So they're kind of saying to us in the budget review that when they look at that debt, they are sort of, they cannot actually really stabilize it at the moment because growth is so low. So we have to go to the markets and we have to borrow. But there is sort of still appetite for the markets out there for South African debt. So that's still carrying on. But I think at some point you have to look at other things to fix. So this time they did not look sort of on the revenue side of things, but there are bigger structural things that need to happen there so that we don't actually go to the market and keep on borrowing this money. So to credit rating agencies, I mean, it's the whole package that they're going to look at. They're not only going to look at this, they're going to obviously look at what's going on fiscally, but they're going to look at this and they're going to look at it and say, what are you spending that money on? That's the first thing. Then they're going to look at what kind of policy environment do you have, and are you getting yourself out of the messes that you're getting yourself out of? Then they're going to look at what's going on with growth, and that looks abysmal. It is actually very pedestrian growth that we are forecasting, and they're going to look at the whole picture. So the Nedbank view is they're going to look at that picture, and there's probably in the next 2 months we probably might get that downgrade, but I think the market has already sort of discounted the fact that we're going to probably get that downgrade. But if you look at the figures, I mean, they don't look that nice in general.
Okay, Busisiwe, we're going to leave it there because we are toing and froing, but thank you so much for your insights. Busisiwe Radebe just giving us her insights there. We're going to cross over to my colleague, Manelisi. Manelisi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nompu, and I am joined now by the ANC spokesperson, Pule Mabi. Mr. Mabi, thank you very much for coming. Your take to the minister's speech?
Well, thank you very much as well. Well, the minister has spoken to issues that bring about relief and stability to our own economy, and was quite realistic. I mean, he could not have been honest in the manner that he was. The fact that he's now beginning to focus us on investment in the future to make sure that the future generations could be able to construct a country of their own dreams as well. One, that we're turning South Africa into a construction site. This is going to be very critical towards the creation of jobs. The way we are dealing with our own GDP debt ratio to inflation is very important. It means that going into the future, we are sure that there could be a sense of stability. The establishment of a state-owned bank, the sovereign wealth fund, all of these are necessary measures to turn things around. But not only that, the president spoke about the building of a new university, and a new university that focuses on science, technology and innovation in Eguruleni. The minister has already announced on the sort of steps and the allocation of resources towards that work. This means that we are all putting shoulder to wheel. The things that we in the ANC have spoken about, whether through our own Mahotlas, through the State of the Nation's address presented by the president here in the National Assembly, shows that we are committed to secure the future. That they've also spoken about the creation of new industries, funded amongst others through the carbon tax that shall have been created, bringing billions and billions of rands in the next few years, shows that there is some sort of a relief and a leadership that is reimagining how the future must begin to look like. But also, there is also an important focus on energy security. We believe done well, this could also work towards the attraction of investment in our shores.
And I guess the ANC will fully support him when he cut the wage bill.
Well, of course, there are engagements that ought to be happening with the trade union movement. The president has already said that at the beginning of every month, he does those engagements, even through the NATLEC processes, to make sure that whatever interventions that are being made, we also take through with us other stakeholders. That there's not going to be an increase on VAT, that we are lessening on corporate tax. All of these measures are necessary to give our people relief, but allow those that are in business to be able to also participate without feeling any pressure.
My question was, will the ANC support him fully on cutting the wage bill?
My answer was that those engagements are happening at a different level. So the ANC will be guided by the outcomes of those engagements. Because as the ANC and the leader of the alliance, we believe that we do not have to leave our alliance partners behind in the work that we are doing.
Bulemabi, spokesperson of the ANC. Thank you very much. And now I will cross over to my colleague Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Manelisi. Of course, now we're going to bring into conversation IFP spokesperson on finance, Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi. Is this a pro-poor budget?
This budget is not pro-poor at all. But we appreciate the minister's honesty, because what he was doing was telling the country that our country is not at all in a good space, that our economy is not growing, which is very bad news for the mass unemployed. So as the IFP, we thought that even the 63 billion, which is a downward revision, wasn't going to target departments like human settlement, because we've got millions of our people who are homeless and are living in shacks, and also that he has cut so much on the Department of Education, yet we've got people who don't have even classrooms to learn from. So that is why we are saying this budget was never pro-poor at all. But we're very good that he was very honest. But we're also happy that the minister touched on a little bit on the issue of dealing with corruption and maladministration and wasteful expenditure. But we're yet to see how is that going to be implemented, because we have had so much talks around those issues, but no implementation at all. And also we spoke about the issue of the sovereign wealth fund. We appreciate that and we'll come to the IFP, but only if we haven't done with the issues of corruption and maladministration. That will be one of those entities that will be looted, like the VPS of the likes. So we say if the government is serious, we must first put a stop on all the leakages before we can consider anything that is progressive.
All right, thank you so much, Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi. He's the spokesperson on finance for the political party, the Nkatha Freedom Party. Nompu, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Of course, we continue to unpack the budget delivered by the Finance Minister. I'm joined in studio now by Elna Moorman. She's an economist at Standard Bank. Thank you very much, Elna, for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Let's focus a little bit on the shortfall in terms of revenue collections. In the midterm budget, the Finance Minister expected that to be at about 52.5 billion rand, but that's shot up to something like 63 billion rand. That's not a very good picture, and it tells us that SARS is really struggling to collect revenue.
Yes, and of course it's partly reflective of how weak the economy is. The problem with those kinds of shortfalls, because the shortfalls partly comes from the revenue side, it's just that it then creates a very weak base effect. In other words, if I didn't get enough revenues last year, then my growth this year comes from a lower base, and so it has a long-term effect if we have these revenue under recoveries. But I have to say that, to my mind, is one of the upside risks in terms of the fiscal picture. So the downside risks are very obvious. The downside risks to growth and therefore tax collections, I think, are quite well known. Yes. But there's a lot of talk in the budget documents about the turnaround at SARS and the increased efficiencies, etc. Treasury hasn't yet included any numbers on the back of that into the fiscal forecasts. But the estimates that we've heard are quite significant. So maybe that is something that then ultimately at least counteracts the downside risks.
And then, of course, in terms of the debt trajectory, we did talk about it with Busisiwe, but we couldn't speak about it at length. 65.6% debt to GDP ratio. That's quite huge, and what does that then do from a ratings agency perspective?
Yeah, I sometimes think that it's a little bit abstract to understand whether 65% is affordable or not, but I think that the way to look at it is to say by the end of the 3-year forecast period, our interest will be 300 billion rand. We're spending less than 200 billion on social grants in total. And we can compare that 300 billion to the 160 billion that we spent on interest in 2016. And so it's not only the fact that we're saying we're spending this on interest costs instead of all the social needs, firstly, but secondly, that pace of increase on both debt and debt servicing is just alarming, and that is the unsustainable part. And from a ratings agency perspective, to my mind, that's the issue that will still negatively affect the ratings assessments.
And we continue to bankroll SAA, Eskom, we continue to channel funds in there, although that's not a surprise. We knew that was coming. But what signal does that send?
Yeah, I feel like the important takeaway from the fiscal approach over the last, let's say, 2 years is we have to acknowledge that these problems were kind of growing over a 10-year period. It was a decade of building up these problems, and we shouldn't expect them to be reversed quite quickly. So at the moment, all we can do is give some money and liquidity so that we have time to address the underlying problems. But hopefully, we're now starting to get closer to that point where we get more final decisions on SAA and Eskom, so that we have clarity on where the end is of the fiscal transfers to these SOEs.
Of course, the public sector wage bill, that's going to be a huge deal. Negotiations for the next 3 years will be taking place later in the year. The finance minister has already factored in numbers where he's estimating the kind of cuts he'll be able to make. Do you think that's going to be a big fight for him going down the line?
I think it's going to be a big fight, but I think we've reached the point where we don't really have any alternative. We've increased taxes to very high levels already, and on the spending side, they have already trimmed a lot of the fat. There's probably still some corruption that needs to be addressed, but we don't have an alternative. And so I think we need to look at it from two perspectives. The first is to say he had to include his best guesses. So even though we don't have the wage agreement yet, that is his best forecast. But secondly, to say this is what we can afford. We have a number of ways of getting there. It can either mean that we have more affordable wage increases, or it would have implications for example, employment numbers. So there's some maneuvering that can still happen, but that's all that we can afford.
All right. We're going to leave it there for now, Elna. Now we're going to cross to my colleague, Manelisi.
Thank you very much, Nompu. I'm with the leader of the EFF, Julius Malema, with me. Mr. Malema, you must be happy with this budget, ultimately.
It's not a very bad budget under the circumstances. We welcome the establishment of a state-owned bank, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We also welcome the fact that the minister is trying to ensure that small business becomes the biggest beneficiary out of state spending. But we are disappointed that he has reduced the allocation of local government from 10% to 8.8%, because majority of our people, when they refer to government, they refer to local government. They don't know international relations, they don't know small business, they know local government, and therefore the EFF always advocated for more money to be allocated in local government. We are opposed to renegotiation of the agreement with the workers, the public servants, because that agreement was reached and it was supposed to last for 3 years. And to come in the middle of the agreement, say, let's renegotiate, is to tamper with the planning of the workers. We welcome the money into the SAA, welcome the money into Eskom.
But still there, Mr. Malema. But doesn't he have to cut the budget, though? I mean, the wage bill, though.
No, he can cut the wage bill going forward. But the agreement, as we speak now, it has been reached. It must be honored. Every agreement should worth the paper written on. Because if we can just renegotiate in the middle of an agreement, it's taking us back to those days where negotiations take place every year and there is no certainty of what is going to happen.
But doesn't the EFF become flexible here, because the circumstances that prevailed then are no longer there right now? We're in a very, 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 very bad economic situation.
There are many areas where we can cut just to honor this agreement and see it through. And when we go back to the bargaining council, we renegotiate a better deal. There are many areas which, if we sit down with the minister, we can be able to point in those areas and say to him, Minister, it is not necessary for the state to continue to fund some of these unnecessary programs. Let's honor the deal and see it through, because those workers are not going to be happy. And if we can see an industrial action by workers, especially now under the circumstances, our situation will be worse.
Mr. Malema, thank you very much for your time. That's the president of the EFF, Julius Malema, totally opposed to the renegotiation of the agreements between the minister and the civil servants. Nompu, it's back to you.
Thanks very much, Manelisi. Well, to get a business perspective on the finance minister's budget, I'm joined in studio by Mike Brown. He's the CEO of Nedbank. Thanks very much for joining us, sir. So what's your overall view of the budget this year?
I think the budget shows you just what a difficult place the South African economy is right now, because effectively what you see is the low rates of GDP growth, and all of them have been revised downwards again from the medium-term budget statement, and actually now look much more realistic, in line with where most market commentators' expectations are for GDP growth. But as soon as that GDP growth number gets revised downwards, what does it mean? It means government's revenue is under pressure. If the economy is producing less, government is going to get less taxes. And where the ministers had to focus is on expenses, because that revenue line is under so much pressure. So I think rightly he's had a big focus on expenses. The key is, can he actually deliver the savings that he has spoken about in the short to medium term? And the real key for South Africa is we really need the structural reform in our economy, a lot of it that's set out in the Treasury paper, to boost GDP growth rates. That's the only way we can get our country's debt levels back under control again, is through growth. In the short term, we can do things on expenditure, but over the longer term, it has to be through growth.
You run a bank, you know a lot about capital markets. Are we going to dodge the ratings downgrade?
I think it's going to be really close, because if you look effectively at what's happened to deficits and debt to GDP, which is what the rating agencies will be really focused on, they get worse in the short term than what was in the medium-term budget statement. So the fiscal deficits are higher than what we told the world about in November, but right at the back end of the budget, they start to get better again. So I think, we may have done enough that they watch to see, can we actually deliver this trajectory? Because somewhere debt does need to consolidate or reduce. And right now it's still going up, and that's a problem.
Do you get the sense that we're getting enough detail about infrastructure spending or not?
Yeah, so I think, in short, I think we do need more detail. There's a lot that is said, and what people are really focused on is, when does it turn to action? So, for example, fantastic that the minister focused on consistent, reliable energy supply as the #1 problem facing our economy. If we don't have that, we cannot grow by more than around about 1%. So we've had lots of conversations around municipalities being able to procure their own energy, businesses being able to set up their own energy generation. But what people are going to really focus on is, when does the first one of those switch on? Not when people stand up and talk about policies. Yes. When do we actually get something connected to the grid and real net positive input into the electricity?
Are you worried that implementation continues to be a problem, or should we just wait and see?
No, I think we're all very worried that implementation continues to be a problem. We've had, a number of years of a big deficit between what we say and what we do, but we've kicked the can right to the very end of the road. Debt to GDP numbers that are projected to go well above 70%. There's no more space. So we're in last chance saloon for implementation.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mike, for your insights. That was Mike Brown, the CEO of Nedbank. We're going to go over now to my colleague Bulelani.
Well, thank you so much, Nompu. Of course, the biggest question is whether this budget, is it business friendly? To talk to me more about this now is the president of the Black Management Forum, Andile Nomlala. Thank you so much for joining me. Did the minister strike a right chord for business?
Most definitely for black business. We are too pleased, particularly about the detail that is yet to come on the state-owned bank. I'm worried about some terminologies that he used on it leaning too commercially. I mean, we had experiences with the current existing commercial banks, but as black business, we're not going to necessarily have a negative view about it now, because we have the opportunity in any case to talk to the minister and deal with the detail. Another positive aspects about the budget is the creation, obviously, of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I would believe that South Africa, despite the fact that others are saying that we don't have surplus budget at the moment, but there are many strategic mineral resources that we can use and divert equity holding to government so that we can fund for the future. We are very pleased as black business by the idea of infrastructure spending, and we are actually now looking more on the capital expenditure than OPEX. And as black business people, will be in partnership with government in making sure that those projects are being realized and black business is prioritized. For us, we don't have much to cry, because government is our government. We will engage with them. Where we differ, we'll differ robustly so, but where we support, we'll be there to help and give a hand.
All right, thank you so much, Andile Nomlala. He is, of course, the president of the Black Management Forum. Nombu, it's over to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Well, Mike Brown has now gone, and I'm joined in studio by the Deputy Finance Minister, Mr. David Masondo. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us.
Thanks,
Good stuff. So, government has decided, National Treasury has decided to cut expenditure on non-interest priorities, your education, police, social security, etc., to the tune of 156 billion rand over the next 3 fiscal years, something like that. What is the basis of that? Because obviously we know that you're looking to cut the public sector wage bill, but you haven't begun negotiations with the sector to be able to properly estimate how much you'd be able to cut that by.
The reason why we've decided to cut the expenditure by 261 billion is mainly because our public debt is 3.5 trillion and we pay 250 something billion on interest. I mean, as you know, in your household, if you have got debt, your expenditure is high, your income is low, you've got to do something about that situation. And therefore we said, given the limited resources that we have as government, we've got to cut somewhere, including sacrificing certain expenditure items, as you correctly say, education, some infrastructure, as well as transportation. And we are beginning to negotiate, have discussions with the public sector workers around the wage bill, which is one of the major costs insofar as our ability to deliver service as the public service as a whole. And I must indicate that the public servants, workers, they are better off today in terms of the income that they basically get, because they got wage increases 2003, 2011, 2010, which were higher than the inflation. And once you set a wage at a particular level, you have to pay it over time. So we're beginning to have conversations around that on how can we just make sure that we're not focusing on the wage bill only. There are a number of items that we're looking at, including at the cost, the amount of money that we pay for public representatives. I mean, for instance, the president has decided that there will be no increase for public representatives, including myself, because all of us, we've got to take responsibility and feel the pinch of the cut of this budget.
Yes. So would you describe this as an austerity budget? Because, you know, there is a concern that when you cut spending, particularly on key services, we know that in, you know, certain areas, there are not enough nurses, there are not enough police officers, there are, you know, not enough doctors and so on and so forth. How do you get the balance right between ensuring that quality services are given to the public while you're busy also cutting the wage bill?
So this is a tough budget, but it's not an austerity budget. If it was austerity, we'll be saying we're stopping social grants, we must cut on the teachers that we basically have, the nurses, the police. All what we are saying is that the wage price that we pay for public servants is very high, and it makes it very difficult for us to get more nurses, more teachers into the public service. And that has an impact on our ability to deliver the service to the people. Therefore, we're saying, let's have a conversation around the wage bill so that we'll have the monetary power and ability as the state to get more people into the public service, because the population is also increasing, but the number of the public servants is stagnant, and precisely because of the wage bill. And we're saying, let's have a conversation around the price of labor in the public service.
Yeah.
Actually, it does increase above the average increase in the economy as a whole.
Now, you can't please everyone when you deliver a budget, of course, but why are we continuing to fund SAA?
So SAA, we said they need to restructure, and part of the restructuring, they need to look at their business model. Because the business model that they have is not sustainable. Other airlines, their business model is integrated with their hospitality. For instance, they will say, we have a close connection. If you book a flight in country X using that airline, they give you the total package, accommodation, and other services which are related to the hospitality industry. In our case, the business model of SAA is basically outdated, and they need to look at that. And for them to put SAA on a different path, they need some money, and that money that we're allocating to them, it's meant to help them to restructure SAA in order for it to be commercially viable, to aid and support our economy, including tourism.
Tell us about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I see that you're going to be putting some 30 billion rand into it, but where are you going to be sourcing the funds?
So the Sovereign will get it from some of our reserves, and the point about Sovereign Wealth Fund, you're saving money for the rainy days, because the economy is never static, that moments when it goes down into recessions. So you want to have enough resources even for those rainy days. And it's for this reason that we're setting up the Sovereign Wealth Fund, taking some money from the reserve, not only going forward. I mean, if we sell the spectrum, we will say, let's take some of the money into the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the minerals, royalties, let's take some money into the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And many countries, China, Singapore, they do have their own sovereign wealth funds, and they use them strategic. So, and what we'll be doing now is also to set up proper governance structures and processes, so that that money is not used in a manner that is not beneficial to the South African economy and the South African citizens.
We only have very little time left, but it is encouraging to see that you've confirmed what the President said in the State of the Nation address, that indeed funds are going to be released for grade R to grade 3 learners in terms of them being able to code and do robotics. But what's the quantum? That wasn't very clear. And of course, how do you ensure, because this is a new area, how do you ensure that those children are taught by people who do know about these particular disciplines, because it is a new thing?
I think the Minister of Education, she will give the details when she presents her budget vote on how she will translate the allocation that we've made to education to make sure that indeed the objectives that the President has articulated in the State of the Nation address are realized.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was David Masondo. He's the Deputy Finance Minister, and he was just giving us an overview of the budget. Now we're going to cross to my colleague, Manelisi.
Thank you very much, Nompu. I'm now joined by the NFP spokesperson, Sheikh Imam. Sheikh, the minister tried to strike a very delicate balance under very difficult fiscal circumstances.
Yes, indeed. I think a very balanced budget today by the minister, and I think he's done exceptionally well, with much of the emphasis on economic development. For the first time, I think the emphasis has been on the economic cluster. Previously, remember, the emphasis used to be on education, on health. I think here what is done today is a fantastic job, and I think if implemented, yes, indeed, I think we can turn the tide around.
And you also mentioned something about improving our electricity supply. Are you satisfied on that sphere?
Yes, indeed. You remember that is going to impact on economic growth in the country, you know, with the challenges we have, particularly with Eskom at the moment. He has spoken about it. He has very, very clear about it. You can see he's going into independent public power producers. He's talking about municipalities being able to buy their own electricity. And I think that will do good for the country at this point. I think the only concern is this, when it is privatized and goes into independent power producers, is there not a risk at some stage for the cost of electricity to escalate, which will be beyond the reach of ordinary South African? And that's what I think we're going to have to be careful about.
Sheikh Imam, thank you very much for your time. And that is the NFP spokesperson, Sheikh Imam. And now I cross over to my colleague, Bulelani.
Thank you so much, Manelisi. Of course, now joining me is the president of the AIC, Mr. Mandle Nkosi Galo. Sir, is this a pro-poor budget? Does it assist the men and women staying in rural areas?
We are very much disappointed by the budget speech by the minister, because it is not people-centered. For instance, take the allocation of 420 to your local municipalities, that money is very, very little. Given the fact that the municipalities at that level are expected to deliver services to the poorest of the poor masses. But if you will allocate just 420 billion, that is an insult. We are tired of seeing protest activities, violent protest activities, simply because the people at that level are demanding services from the same municipalities which are not being supported by the central government. We are saying we are not happy with this budget, but we must appreciate the fact that the minister has increased a little bit, on your social grants and your child support grant, but that is not enough as well. We thought that the minister will increase the social grants a little bit because the grannies are suffering. They are feeding their own grandchildren with this money. At the same time, they are expected to look after their health, so on and so forth. So that is very, very little, but we appreciate that he thought of increasing that amount.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mandla Nkosi Galo. Of course, he is the president of the African Independent Congress. For more reaction, Manelisi is standing by.
Thank you very much, Bulelane. I'm now joined by the leader of Al Jama, Mr. Hendricks. Mr. Hendricks, are you happy? Are you not happy about the budget?
Yeah, very happy that there's no VAT increase and that a lot of taxpayers will get the tax reduction. Also very excited that we are getting closer to creating the 100,000 business opportunities for young people. 2.2 billion has now been set aside for SEDA to allocate. We are a bit worried that the loans to start up businesses for young people will attract interest. SEDA charges too much interest. The president, the minister should have announced measures. He spoke about interest-free commitments. He should have also indicated that these loans would be interest-free. So while the businesses, there's hope for small businesses, very disappointed that the minister did not allocate any money for NGOs to address gender-based violence. You can't depend on government departments to address it alone. And NGOs cannot assist if they also get funding. The idea of a state bank is very exciting. We originally heard that they will only take deposits, but now they will also give loans. In the Small Business Portfolio Committee, we are going to lobby that the loans given especially to entrepreneurs must also be interest-free so that they can become profitable as soon as possible. As far as the old age pension is concerned, we welcome the 80 Rand. But we feel the government must move closer so that pensioners get at least 3,000 Rand a month.
Don't you think he gave with one hand and took with another when he increased the petrol prices?
Yes, most of us walk. Most of South Africans walk, so it doesn't affect them a lot. But obviously they will have to, those who can afford taxis and buses will have to pay more. So yes, I do agree that there was a balancing act, and our minister has to balance a lot of interests, and he also has to balance the interests of the different factions in the ruling party, and that makes his job very difficult.
Mr. Hendricks, thank you very much. That's the leader of Al Jama, Mr. Hendricks. Nompo, it's back to you again on the studio.
Thanks very much, Mandlisi, for that. Well, in studio now, I'm joined by Delia Ndlovu. She's the MD for Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal. Thanks very much for joining us. Good stuff. So, a huge surprise that the finance minister didn't really raise any of the major taxes, but was it a surprise for you?
I think it wasn't, in the sense that he focused a lot on fiscal consolidation, which is what the country needs right now. So you've heard a lot about the Laffer curve, which is essentially the law of diminishing returns, that you can only raise taxes up to a point. So I think there is a realization from Treasury's side that households are under strain at the moment. Raising taxes would actually hurt the economy. And with the rating agencies looking at us as a country, they took a view, I think, to say, let us put the brakes on increasing taxes. And in fact, the minister mentioned something about possibly phasing out incentives and looking further into reducing corporate tax rates in the future.
It is worrying, though, that the average growth rate that the Treasury predicts is around 1% over the next few years. And we know that international bodies and other bodies actually expect that come this year we're going to grow at sub 1%. So given that, and given what you've said about that Laffer curve, that you can only tax so much as that applies to personal tax and corporate tax, surely that also applies to things like the fuel levy and so on. Because if we keep on getting these compound additions of taxes on these things that we need to pay for because we need to move by car and so on and transport, surely at some point they won't be able to tax us as well going forward.
I have to say that just based on what I heard, the increases that he mentioned, to me it was just inflationary increases. There was nothing in there that gave me alarm around the fact that this is a hefty sort of increase. It sounded like he's just increasing just mildly to match with inflation.
Yes.
And I think what is also important to notice is that he also gave relief to the middle class, as well as the low-income earners, in the sense that he said that someone earning 10,000 rand will now pay 10,000 less tax, and those earning around 100,000 will pay about 1.5% less tax. So I think that is a good thing.
From your perspective, does the tax situation suddenly change the mindset of a potential business investor in South Africa to say, well, things are not looking too hectic and they're talking about cutting corporate income taxes, maybe I can invest there, or it's too early?
I think it's a step in the right direction to boost business confidence. Because what the rating agencies keep telling us is that in order to improve your economy, you need to look at stimulating demand of households and stimulating demand in the private sector. So I think that is top of mind for Treasury at the moment, which is why I think they went the route that they went, with focusing more on reducing the wage bill in the public sector and leaving households alone, and in fact giving the middle class some sort of relief.
Do you think that there could have been a bit more relief for SMEs, because that's supposed to be the sector that's going to bring us the real job creation?
I think the minister did mention something around the youth employment initiative and also looking at entrepreneurship in that program. So the fact that the leadership is focusing on this, we need to give them a chance to see what they come back with. The president mentioned it in his SONA statement, so did the minister. So we need to give it a bit of a chance, but take hope from the fact that leadership is giving it, a fresh look, and entrepreneurship is top of mind for them.
Super. Delia, thank you so much for your time and your insights. That was Delia Ndlovu. She's the MD for Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal. Now we're going to go back to Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Nompu. Of course, now joining me is SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kisweta. Sir, did you push for more taxes for this budget, given that you want to collect more?
Bulelani, I think the decision in the Treasury family is that there is every intention to provide tax relief and not increase taxes. We've reached the point where we believe that tax generally is a blunt instrument, and by just raising taxes now, you don't get a better outcome. In fact, you get a worse outcome, because you take money out of the economy that could be doing other things and have multiplier effects. And secondly, you also begin to negatively impact on compliance culture, which is a huge area of concern. Tax revenue is driven by three things. Firstly, tax policy on any given economy. Secondly, the public confidence and compliance levels. And thirdly, the capability of SARS to administer its laws. On the tax morality, we have seen a decline in tax morality. We have seen an increase in criminal activities, an increase where quite frankly, certain individuals create businesses with no other intent but to defraud the fiscus. We are busy with 600 cases of VAT fraud. Last week we saw 2 individuals being criminally prosecuted for that. We will intensify that effort. And then thirdly, we know that the capability of SARS has been compromised. And so building that, particularly in 3 areas, is important for us. Firstly, in terms of our technical skills, audit capability, investigative capability, very important. Secondly, in the use of data, using more machine learning and artificial intelligence. We've got enormous stores of data that we can improve the use of. And then thirdly, delivering digital online services that just makes fulfilling your compliance obligations so much more efficient.
Talking about your investigative capacity, can you give us assurance that whatever investigations that you're doing will be above board and in compliance with the law?
There is no question. I have red-carded any behavior by any SARS official that is not beyond reproach. So we will only tolerate a fair, even-handed approach by SARS. We act without fear, favor or prejudice. If any individual, and if the public reports to us an individual who has broken that oath of secrecy or who have broken the trust that is placed on them, there is no place for such people in SARS. Just last week, we had an individual resign because of an incident where they abused their power. We will not tolerate it. You cannot have confidence in us if you don't believe that we will be fair and firm.
I want to get your opinion. Was there not a rogue unit within SARS from what you understand as now the incumbent?
My opinion. So here is what we know. We know that the NPA has decided that there's no evidence to prosecute the matter further. Secondly, KPMG, who produced a report, have withdrawn that report. Thirdly, the judge who was involved in an investigation gave an unqualified apology for that. Fourthly, the matter that the public protector is being dealt with, we are taking on review in the normal way that we should, right? Lastly, not my opinion, but my observation is I have seen no evidence that suggests that SARS has created any capacity or entity to do anything which is not fairly and squarely permitted in law. We follow the law in its full extent, and we do so in a professional manner without fear and favor. Will it step on people's toes? Of course it will. And you have to make up your mind. So I'd like to hear your opinion when you listen to the detractors, when you listen where the voices of dissent are coming from. Ask yourself what's their real motive.
Lastly, Mr. Kesweta, before I let you go, will you release the bank statements of former President Jacob Zuma?
Let me talk about taxpayer confidentiality. This has nothing to do with an individual. Individual taxpayers, whoever you are, whether you're the president or a normal township dweller, you're entitled to the same treatment in law. There's no different law for big people or small people or rich people or poor people or companies or individuals. The same law across the board. Therefore, every taxpayer, we will apply the confidentiality of. There are only 2 instances where we will set that provision aside. The first is if the taxpayer gives us written permission, which we can verify that he or she is comfortable with us doing that. And secondly, if we are instructed to do so through a court order.
All right, thank you so much, SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kesweta, giving us a lot of issues that affect his portfolio. Going back to studio now, Nompu is standing by.
Everybody. Thanks very much, Bulelani, for that. Well, I'm joined in studio. We're just rolling in the guests today. I'm joined in studio by Isaiah Mhlanga. He's chief economist at Alexander Forbes, and Titi Hatendi Matika. She's the head of retail investment, and she is from ABSA. And they're just joining me now to just give us their insights on the budget. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Titi, let me start with you. Was this, in your view, since you look after the retail sector, was this very much a consumer budget?
Yes. So for once, there was quite a bit of relief for the consumer. And one could argue that the consumer could take a little bit more, particularly high net worth individuals. But we've seen the numbers. We've seen that your high net worth individuals have been leaving South Africa in higher numbers. And those are the people who are actually supporting the tax base. So it's a very positive budget, especially for the middle income also people. We saw that the lower income got quite a bit of relief, particularly when it comes to the taxes. And then also for first-time buyers, having $1 million and lower being exempt to transfer duties, that's quite positive.
Yes.
Lower sin taxes, lower fuel levy, very good. So positive on that side.
And then in terms of our budget deficit, that's gone to around 65.5% of GDP. We've got a debt stock of 3.56 trillion rand. That's a lot of money. But when you think about it in the context of the ratings agencies, is that good enough?
I don't think it's nearly good enough, because if you look at our debt to GDP ratio, it continues to rise. If you look at the primary balance, which National Treasury said in the last MTBPS that it's going to close in 2022-2023, now it's saying it's no longer possible, which means we don't achieve any debt sustainability. From a credit rating agency, it's negative. But one thing I think that you can give to Treasury, they said we are not going to consolidate at all costs. So we can let the fiscal slip a bit, so that we can stabilize SOEs, largely ESCOM, so that we can provide stable electricity, which can support economic growth.
Yeah.
But in so doing, it means we lose part of the fiscal credibility that we had. Because remember, fiscal credibility means when you tell the market this is what you're going to do, you actually do it and achieve it in the time frame that you say. Failure to do that means the market is no longer going to believe you the next time you table a budget. And that has implications for two things. One, the interest cost for the state rises, because bond yields will remain quite elevated despite a fall in inflation.
Yes.
But the second thing is it is also inflationary, in the sense that when you fail to reach your revenue targets, you have to raise other tax revenues from administered prices. For instance, we saw sin taxes across the board rising, and those things are inflationary, which means for a monetary policy point of view, it means we are not going to get the interest rate cuts that you would otherwise get, because inflation will remain quite elevated because of those taxes that come through. But it's quite positive in the sense that we don't have new taxes that have been imposed on the economy.
Yes.
But from an investment point of view, in terms of signaling, Treasury tells us that they are looking into lowering corporate income tax in future, but that is going to be done in a revenue neutral way, in the sense that they're going to close some of the loopholes through which companies are not paying taxes.
Titi, you can tinker around the edges, put a bit more money in the pockets of consumers and all of that, but to the extent of stimulating investment in the South African economy, did the budget do that?
So that's a tricky one. I think it goes to the credibility thing that Isaiah was talking about, where we actually need businesses to believe. We also need everyone to believe the story, right? So if the unions come to the party and government actually does manage to negotiate the government bill, wage bill, to be what they say it's going to be, then I think that is positive in the long term. But up until that point, when we see that coming through, everyone is going to be a bit skeptical about what does this mean for long term, and do businesses actually start investing again in South Africa? And also the rating agencies, right? So everyone is still waiting for what Moody's is going to say after they analyze. So do we find out on the 27th of March? Some people are thinking possibly they might push it out and say we'll see what happens with the wage negotiation. Yeah. So there's a lot here that's still to be. I think today didn't resolve enough.
Yeah.
So I think the short to medium term still very uncertain.
Okay. Don't go anywhere. We're going to cross to my colleague now, Bulelani Philip, who's got a politician with him.
So much, Nombu. Of course, talking about issues of State Bank is one of the biggest announcements that were made, firstly, during the State of the Nation address, and now being confirmed by the Finance Minister. I bring into the conversation Mr. Kes Kuvadia, who is the CEO of the Banking Association of South Africa. Do you take this announcement of the State Bank seriously, or are they just bluffing?
No, we've got to take it seriously. I mean, the President mentioned it in the SONA. The Minister has now put some more meat to it. We still have the view that we need to be convinced why there is a need for a state bank. I think that what we would want to see is an interaction between the commercial banks as they exist today, cooperative banks as they exist today, and government to see how we can work together to make dysfunctional markets functional. Okay, so my assumption is that the state bank is there to try and service markets that commercial banks are not servicing at the moment.
But does that not indicate that the commercial banks have failed the poor? We also have reports of banks that are racially profiling people. Have you not failed as commercial banks?
No, I don't think we have. If you look at the performance of the banking industry in the last 10 years and the access to financial services that people have in this country, it's gone up significantly. Okay, the reality is that commercial banks, as would the state bank, by the way, be regulated under the Banks Act, regulated by the Prudential Authority, and those regulations put very, very strict conditions on how you are going to use depositors' funds. Now, we expect the state bank, as the minister has said, will operate on commercial principles, and we expect it to operate on commercial principles. So if you cut through the complexity of banking, what's banking about? It's taking depositors' money, gearing that money in the market and raising more money, and then lending that out in a way that there's a more than reasonable possibility that you'll get the money back. If you don't get that money back, you're threatening depositors' funds. State bank can't do anything different. Unless you're saying that if a state bank lends money with no probability of getting that money back, and then when the depositors want the money, the state is going to bail the bank out. Well, we don't have money to bail anything out at the moment, okay?
So are you opposed to this idea of a state bank?
Government wants to form a state bank, they must form a state bank. It's their decision. What I'm saying is that I'm not convinced what a state bank is going to do that commercial banks cannot do currently.
All right, I want us to switch attention now to this idea of a sovereign wealth fund. Can we afford it? Is it feasible?
I agree with the minister. The minister said that this is a long-term plan. I agree with the minister that this is something that we should strive towards, because I think it's good to have a sovereign wealth fund, because that can be utilized in counter-cyclical situations, can be utilized if the country finds itself under serious stress. But I do have a problem, the minister saying that, for instance, one way of funding this would be the income that you get from spectrum or income that you get from elsewhere. Our view would be that any income that the government has that is not utilized for the provision of services and government services must be used to reduce our current debt. We are paying upwards of 15 cents in a rand on our current debt. That stops us from channeling monies to social services. That creates the budget deficit. That creates problems amongst investors and rating agencies and so on. So any additional money we have, we must use to reduce the current debt. As we get toward the situation where we're reducing our budget deficit, getting toward the budget surplus, then we can start putting the sovereign wealth fund on the table, and from surpluses begin to capitalize it.
Casco Vadia, CEO of the Banking Association of South Africa, giving us his view on the state bank and the sovereign wealth fund. Manelisi is standing by for more reaction.
Thank you very much, Bulelane. We're now switching over to the International Women's Forum, and we're joined by Charlene Chanley of the organization. The minister touched on a whole lot of things. What stood out for you?
The one thing that stood out for me is the fact that women was not mentioned in the budget. I don't know if it was an oversight or what, but I assume so. Because remember, we know that the President in the State of the Nation address spoke about gender-based violence, the importance of it, top of the agenda, what needs to be done. So I was a bit disappointed that we didn't hear an allocation of funds specifically towards fighting gender-based violence, because we all know that productivity at the workplace is impacted by gender-based violence. I mean, women can't go to work if they have to if they are beaten up the night before or abused. Children, if you have to look for your children because they've disappeared, it all impacts productivity. So I think maybe it was an oversight in a very well-balanced budget. I mean, overall, in terms of the budget itself, I think it is well-balanced, but the aspect of women is important, that also take top agenda item when we talk about allocation of funds.
But I'm sure you'll take solace to the fact that he announced a whole increase of a number of grants, the majority of which are women who benefit from those.
Yes, of course. But remember, grants, you know, we are addressing the needs of the poor, and I'm very happy at least the increase. There are grants allocated to the elderly and the disabled and to, you know, for parenting. I think it's very, very positive because remember, we also we're almost a welfare state, taking care of between 18 to 21 million people, you know, and so we've gone a long way to address that. But at the end of the day, what is a challenge for us as a country? We have to create jobs. Who's going to create the jobs? It's on the top of the agenda of our president. The CFO, which is our Minister of Finance, has to allocate funds for that. So I think our big challenge is to create jobs, and who's going to do that? It's the small, medium enterprises, allocation of funding towards them, tax incentives, for example, for corporations, and women's businesses. I mean, women are the ones who have to feed their children every day, people from small to medium to large businesses. When women are involved, they will ensure that funds are spread further, and they will stimulate the economy as well. So there's been an allocation. I think we're very happy. There will be a state bank, there will be a sovereign wealth fund, and obviously as part of that allocation, we would also be the ones to advocate that some of that funding needs to go towards women, businesses, small and medium, completely.
Thank you very much. That's Irene Irene Shanley from the International Women's Forum. Nompo, it's back to you.
Thanks very much, Manalisi. Well, I am joined in our studio by Isaiah Mhlanga, Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes, and Titi Hatendi Matika. She's the Head of Retail Investment at ABSA. And so we continue our conversation. Isaiah, I wanted to ask you about the municipalities. Of course, the Finance Minister mentioned specifically some additional funding being given. It's normal anyway that every year municipalities are given a certain level of money and so on. But of course, municipalities do serve as an Achilles heel for us in our society because often there isn't delivery. The Attorney General, the Auditor General, pardon me, will tell us often that there's a lot of wasteful expenditure and so on. To what extent do you think government is serious about ensuring that municipalities become more effective? And are you confident about the future? Because without the municipalities working, it really is very negative for both business and communities.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the post-Shelf government over the past 2 years or so, it has been speaking about a capable state. And by that, they mean a state which is able to deliver services to the millions of citizens across the country. And the point of a service delivery is at the local government elections, which is municipalities. So to that effect, we have seen a concerted effort or plans to make sure that government is professionalized, but it's going to take some time. We have to agree or to understand that the problems at municipal level are deep and structural, which is why we have a significant number of municipalities that don't even pass audits from the Auditor General. Every year, over 50 billion is lost through fruitless spending because the money is mismanaged. But to capacitate municipalities, it will take some time. Putting the right people that are that can run municipalities efficiently, it will also take some time. But at least from a signaling point of view or a goal point of view, government is looking to professionalize municipalities and capacitate them so that they can run efficiently.
Yeah. Titi, in terms of the municipalities, what's your view?
So if one links to what the President spoke about during the State of the Nation address, talking about generating energy through the municipalities that have clean audits. So one starts to think that government is actually signaling completely that if we fix this, then we also fix the ESCOM problem, right? So you've got a linkage here where you need to have a solid story. You can't just hope and pray that the municipalities will fix themselves. Government has to help them to enable that to happen. But also within the social compacts that the president keeps talking about, and he mentioned many times during State of the Nation, the people also have to pay. So you can't just expect services, and you can't expect municipalities to run without you as the people who receive the services paying for them.
Yeah.
So there has to be that tie-in where, and again, it goes to the state of the economy where people are losing jobs. So if I don't have a job, then how am I supposed to pay my bills? So it becomes a chicken and egg story. And once the economy starts going, I think these things get resolved. But how do you start the economy going? And that's what government was probably trying to do with this budget.
So earlier, I did speak with the Deputy Finance Minister, David Masondo, and I asked him about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I remember at the time that SONA was delivered, many in the private sector just poo-pooed it and said, you know, we've got deficits left and right and centre, budget deficits, and of course a huge debt mound and so on and so forth. But they've gone ahead and created this Sovereign Wealth Fund. They're talking about 30 billion rand. I asked him where it would come from, and he talked about the fact that it would come from, some of it would come from our reserves, which are held by the central bank. The central bank reports to us as the public every month as to how much is there and so on and so forth. And it's there for, you know, as a buffer in case things go wrong in the economy and so on and so forth. And that we'll get it from royalties and all the rest of it. Does it make sense for us to have a sovereign wealth fund when we're not in a primary surplus situation?
Look, I think long-term a sovereign wealth fund is quite useful. You see it in many other countries, the Norwegian countries, even countries like Nigeria do have sovereign wealth fund, but largely it's funded from proceeds from mineral resources. We could have had a sovereign wealth fund in the mid-2000s when the commodity boom was still present, where we still had a lot of mining royalties. But I guess for me, it's separating between mission-critical things and nice-to-haves. And I think at this point in time, we have quite significant problems which require funding. But we haven't demonstrated as a country that we can actually sacrifice some of the spending so that we can save in the sovereign wealth fund. You know, case in point, the wage agreement with Labour is unlikely to pass because as of yesterday, Labour was saying, look, we are not having it, we are not seeing any cuts to the agreement that we did last year, which will expire next year.
Yes.
So those are the compromises that are needed to make sure that we have some money that can be saved into this sovereign wealth fund. But again, it also assumes that whatever proceeds that come from potential gas discoveries do not have line items that are already earmarked to be spent on, so that this money can be saved in a sovereign wealth fund, which I think at this point in time it's a little bit far-fetched. Long term, it's good, but the current environment may dictate otherwise. But just touching on the reserves that are the Reserve Bank, I will be more confident with the reserves remaining at the Reserve Bank because we know how they are managed. We know it's independent from political influence, but to the extent that this sovereign wealth fund is going to have or to be open to political influence, then we may be creating something that will give us problem in future.
Hold your many thoughts. We're going to cross now to Manelisi. He's got Mr. Musi Maimane with him.
Thank you very much, Nompo. Quite a very familiar face here, former leader of the DA, Mr. Musi Maimane. Mr. Maimane, what was your specific interest in this budget?
Yeah, one, we came here because I think it's important that we realize that we live in two South Africas. You know, there's a South Africa that today was looking for news about SAA, and there's a South Africa where people use taxis, buses, and transport. So I wanted to come and understand how we bridge the gap. Today, we gave 18 billion rands to SAA and didn't give much to poor South Africans who depend on public transport. And ultimately, I think that we could have taken an opportunity to say, what taxes do we use to help small businesses, to help people create more jobs? Because if we can say to someone, if you create a job, we'll give you this tax cut, I think we'll go a long way to be able to help create an economy that creates more jobs for people.
Let me get your take on the creation of the state bank. Do you think it will succeed?
Well, the history of this country has shown that when you create a pool of money, then that money is vulnerable to being captured, to people taking it away. I think as South Africa, we don't have money to be creating a state bank. I think we should be much more focused on other things. This is not a priority for us now. What ought to be happening is if we create development finances, there's already institutions that are available for that, the Land Bank and other banks. And what we should be doing is partnering with the private sector for the purposes of development and stimulating actual economic growth. That's what we need.
Mr. Maimane, thank you very much for your time. That's the former leader of the DA, Mr. Musi Maimane, opposed to the formation of the State Bank. Let me now go to my colleague Bulelane, who's serving a guest out there.
All right, thank you so much, Manelisi. I've got the Justice and Constitutional Development Minister, Ronald Lamola, but I'll speak to him in a moment. But to join the conversation now is the Progressive Professionals Forum. Sorry, it's a tongue twister. Azania Matiwane, is this a progressive budget in your view?
Well, this is a frank and honest budget, first of all, under the conditions. You must remember, the revenue base is very thin. Jobs are being shed every day. Because of also the issue of the global downturn economically. So you would expect that this is going to be the situation. But however, one thing that we're happy about is that there's some homegrown reforms that have been introduced. One of them is around the issue of the cut on, well, not really a cut, but not significant cut on income taxes, which is very important. But the other thing that is important is that, you see, policy slippage is a problem in the country, and this is making many investors to be nervous. And this pronounced itself in a form of unfulfilled promises that have happened. For instance, you've got the issue of the state capture. There's not a single person that has been arrested at this point in time. But we are happy that this budget has prioritized, for instance, in giving more resources to the NPA so that it can be able to effect those. So perhaps after this budget, there can be able to be some sort of recovery in terms of the confidence into the country. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Azania Matiwane from the Progressive Professionals Forum. I'm going to bring into conversation now Ronald Lamola, Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. Mr. Lamola, before we talk budget, you've informed Parliament of the provisional suspension of the Chief Magistrate of Pretoria, Desmond Naya. Why is that?
Yeah, obviously there were allegations, and the allegations have now been looked upon by the Judicial Service Commission, by the Magistrate Commission, and the Magistrate Commission has confirmed that there is a case to be answered by the Chief Magistrate, and they have recommended that I must suspend the Chief Magistrate, which I have concurred with their recommendation, and hence we have informed Parliament.
For the benefit of our viewers at home, the allegation is in relation to Bosasa. Just give us a background of how this allegation came about.
Yeah, obviously I'm not at liberty to talk a lot about what are the allegations and so forth, except what we have informed Parliament, which relates to a benefit of about 200,000 or an alleged benefit in terms of security issues. And we will prefer to leave it there and allow the evidence to be led at the hearing so that we don't prejudice anyone in the process, and allow the evidence to be led at the hearing. And we believe the hearing will be free and fair, and the issues will be properly ventilated there.
Turning to the budget, 2.4 billion for your department to increase capacity of both investigators and prosecutors. Is that enough? Because people are dying to see arrests being made in relation to corruption.
Yeah, obviously there will never be enough money for government. We always want lots, but in our view, this is a very good injection by the National Treasury. It almost came like a Father Christmas for the NPA in particular. As you are aware, they have not been able to fill vacancies in the past 5 years. The vacancy rate at the NPA is almost sitting at 20%, which is huge, which the institution has almost been hemorrhaged, and we're of the view that this is a good start, it's a good foundation, and it will help the NPA to turn around the corner. And it's also good that the injection is not only for the NPA, it goes to the Hawks, the SAPS, and this injection then, if it deals with two police and the NPA, is good, because we have always said when you deal with the police in terms of budget and resources, you must also deal with the NPA in terms of budget and resources, because when the workload increases for the SAPS, it also increases inevitable for the NPA. So I think it was a good intervention by the National Treasury, and we are believing that is a good start to turn the corner around in the institution.
When do we see arrests? Is the NPA, in your view, acting swiftly? Because people want to see arrests.
Yeah, obviously the issue of arrest is a question that you will have to ask the NPA and the Hawks, because the NPA and the Hawks, they then decide based on the evidence and the facts before them, and including the law, whether there is any matter that needs to be prosecuted or for any arrest. So that is for them. Ours, we create an enabling environment for them. We give them the support in terms of resource, in terms of legislation, which we have done, the NPA Act, and also the Constitution, which says they must do their job without any fear, favor, or prejudice to anyone. And we are of the view that they are doing their job. They are, at the right time, they will be able to inform South Africans of whatever decisions that they've taken.
We'll definitely await that right time. Ronald Lamola is the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. For more reaction, Nompu is standing by in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Well, we continue to have conversation with Isaiah Mhlanga and Titi Hatendi Matika, pardon me, here in studio. So I wanted to talk to you about infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important because obviously you need to invest now in infrastructure so that that infrastructure can impact on communities, business and so on, and then we can see economic growth thereafter. But I always find that it's quite vague, the information around infrastructure. We heard about the DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, investing 200 billion rand, government investing in 10 billion rand. What's going on with the infrastructure fund as far as you can understand? And are we getting clarity of communication in this regard?
I think if you go back to the President's State of the Nation, he spoke about 700 billion infrastructure fund over the next 10 years. And you would also remember we had some 2 investment conferences which focused specifically at attracting investment, and that investment is earmarked to go into, by and large, infrastructure in different sectors of the economy, which reduces the cost base of the economy, improves efficiency. They speak about opening up sectors that have been dominated by SOEs to the private sector, whether it's in roads, it's in ports, it's in rail, all those sectors which are quite important, which forms the bedrock of an economy. But government's role there is one that needs to take the initial big risk, but it needs to crowd in private sector investment. By and large, 80% of total investment in the country comes from the private sector. So until we are able to attract the private sector to come and invest in these infrastructure projects, we are not going to be able to do it. So which is why the signaling of reduction in corporate income tax in the years to come, we don't know when that will be. It's going to be quite important because it may attract some of the foreign direct investments to come into those sectors, which can actually boost infrastructure investment.
Titi, the corporate income tax is but one variable that investors would be looking at. But of course, we always bandy around that policy uncertainty. How are we doing in that regard?
So I think if you go back to the infrastructure fund and the thinking around it, right, for investors, the key thing, and I think a lot of people, when the president first mentioned smart cities, for instance, last year in his State of Nation after elections, people actually laughed at it. Some people said, oh, what are you talking about, smart cities? And they've been latching onto that. So today you would have heard a Minister of Finance talking about, Lanseria. And this year we also heard the president talking about the smart cities again. And these are the sorts of things where we need to start thinking outside the box, right? Technology, fourth industrial revolution, these are all things that are happening fast, and South Africa is so behind the curve in some of these areas. So the minister also talked about education and focusing on technology and technicons, new universities. So these are the sorts of things that start to feed into this infrastructure fund, and also businesses investing. So how we look at it as investors, is it bankable projects? So can the government come up with, within these smart cities, projects that may be green projects that you can, as an investor, starts latching onto ESG, and we can sell it onto our direct customers.
You're talking fancy terms. Define that.
So environmentally friendly investments, those things that speak to the consumer who is worried about the future, who's worried about climate change. And these are things that they're thinking very far ahead, but it's things that you can't start thinking about when they're happening. You need to start building. And I think they're building on that story. Yes. And while some people laughed, you can see the thread, the golden thread here. And I think it does have legs, and investors will latch onto it if they have solid structures, and again, if these projects are bankable and we can actually see returns from them.
I think it's quite important just to add to that, to say for ordinary people that work, that have pensions, It's one of the investment avenues actually to augment returns that you get from the JSE, because over the past 5 years you will see traditional asset classes like equities, bonds, they have been declining in terms of their returns. Now we look at other asset classes that are outside of the traditional listed space to try and augment those returns, and infrastructure is one of the asset classes which have been performing quite well over the past couple of years. And I think then it also joined the need to transform the economy, at the same time giving a return to investors. So it achieves both. So it's a good opportunity. It just needs to provide bankable projects which can prove to say from a risk-adjusted return, it's a good return that you would get than what you normally get from traditional asset classes.
Super. Hold your thought there. We're going to cross over to Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Nompu. Whether this budget is pro-poor or for working class people is something that we need to find out. COSATU's spokesman, Matthew Parks, joins me now in this conversation. Matthew, let's start with this wage bill. Are you guys prepared to renegotiate a multi-year agreement?
Look, we're not willing to renegotiate this year's agreement. We signed it in good faith. We made certain compromises. The current year's financial wage agreement is the lowest in about 11 years. So it's an extreme act of bad faith and poor negotiations by government to yesterday to indicate to us that they want to withdraw from this year's agreement. So as far as Labour is concerned, we can't withdraw from it. We're willing to discuss next year and the following 3 years agreements. We're willing to put compromise on the table. Areas we think we can save, reduce the fat, etc. But we can't negotiate in good faith if governments can sign an agreement and afterwards seek to run away from it.
What will you guys do if they call you to the table and want to reduce it?
Look, they'll force workers into a corner, and I wouldn't be surprised if workers then decide to go on strike. That's workers' tool of negotiation. But it's extremely reckless. We tabled proposals to government and to the Lions in November last year around a holistic package of reforms, interventions from ESCOM, the SOEs, the economy, taxes, even the wage bill. They refused to engage. They just ignored us. They said, we'll meet next month. Yet yesterday, a day before the budget speech, they come and say we want to withdraw from the agreement. It makes it very difficult for us to take them seriously, to negotiate in good faith. But look, we're willing as COSATU to still engage. We have no choice. We have to engage because it's our members whose jobs, whose salaries are on the line. It's the families who depend upon them. So we've got proposals on how to reduce wasteful expenditure, how to improve tax reform, even how to save money on the wage bill, especially on top and in the entities. But government has to negotiate in good faith with us.
161 billion reduction over the next 3 years for the wage bill. You probably don't know where it's going to come from. Where must it go to? Are you going to agree to that reduction?
Look, we think there are many areas where we can save money in government. First thing is the Auditor General says we lose 10% of our budget every year to wasteful expenditure and corruption. Government is silent upon that. You need to plug the loopholes, the gaps, before you start looking at other issues. There are also ways to increase tax revenue by capacitating SARS, dealing with the rich who evade paying taxes, dealing with customs enforcement evasion. There's also ways to reprioritize expenditure from within the state to invest in industrial strategies. In the wage bill, there are ways to address issues. You can put the public sector entities under the Public Service Bargaining Council because that's where you really see the ballooning of management wages. You can put ceiling caps on what management earns in the entities. You can reduce what ministers, mayors, premiers, the president, etc. earn significantly. You can reduce what the managers, what the DGs earn. I mean, you can do that in a way which protects public servants, teachers and nurses, police officers, prison wardens, right to a living wage, right to inflation increases, etc. But you have to do it in a smart way. This bull in a China shop approach of government, it really makes life very difficult, and it makes it very difficult for workers to take them seriously.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew Parks, COSATU spokesman. Of course, the workers are on a war path over the government wage bill. From us here in the precinct, from my colleague Maneli Situbas and myself, Bulelani Philippe, it's a wrap from us. And Nombu, it's back to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. So my colleague Bulelani was just speaking to COSATU just now, and they're on a war path around this wage bill, public sector wage bill cut. As the government negotiates with the public sector for the next 3 years, next year is also the national government elections, the local government elections. What is your view on what's going to happen on that one?
I think this is how you can put it. This budget is a compromise on the need for political stability, the need for a private sector-led economic growth, and also the need for transformation. In this case, Labour got something, no tax increases, but for next year, it's unlikely that COSATU is going to agree to cut wages because the agreement has already been signed. You can't rescind on it, but going forward, potentially, if we could get compromises from Labour, that can help. But as it stands, it seems very difficult, which means there is significant execution risk for this budget because it depends a lot on the ability of National Treasury to negotiate with Labour to cut wages.
I'm going to give you the last minute to just give us, anything important that you think has come out of the budget that you want to speak on.
So I think not having a VAT increase for me in the last minute is quite important. I think some people did think it was possible, and particularly for the consumer, this is very good, and for inflation. So at least to anchor inflation and to keep interest rates lower, I think this is quite positive. So that's my last word.
Super. Thank you very much to both of you. That was Tsitsi Hatendi Matika. She's the head of retail investment at ABSA, and of course Isaiah Mhlanga, he's the chief economist at Alexander Forbes. It's been a pleasure bringing the budget speech to you and all the other associated stories around it. I want to thank my colleagues who also made this happen, Bulelani Philip and Manelisa Dubase. Of course, the reporters as well, who are going to be bringing you comprehensive packages on what came out of the budget as well. We do wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Right, thank you very much to our colleagues in Cape Town, Nompumulelo Siziba, together with Manelisa Dubase as well as Bulelani Philip, giving you rolling coverage of the budget speech for 2020 by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Well, the budget has been under scrutiny and analysis throughout the afternoon, and we'll get more deep into things as we'll be talking about government, talking about reforms to the procurement system with a focus of value of own money and maximizing quality and quantity of services, and also Cabinet approving publication of a new public procurement bill. We will also be reflecting on other issues that came out of Parliament regarding assisting SMMEs to be sustainable so that they can create those much needed jobs, a focus and a little touch on how government is intending to assist the SOEs. There has been mention of how local governments which are in good standing can be able to buy power from independent power generators, as well as other issues that we'll be talking about concerning the public healthcare system and allocation of money to the Department of Education. There's so much to talk about, so how about we take a break and we thresh it out with my analysts that are in the studio here. I'll introduce them to you in a moment. We'll be back.
Get a 750 ml JNB blended Scotch whiskey and a 1 liter Schweppes soda water for only $169.99. Only at the Tops at Spars Zip Fest.
That's great value, eh?
Billy! Billy, you have to sing! Sing! Billy! Not for persons under the age of 18.
It's the month of love, and we have our pulse on the hottest love trends of this season. We love travel so much, we know all the romantic getaways. Don't even get us started on those couple goals. There you go. We shake things up and get creative when it comes to expressing that 4-letter word. When it comes to those essential romantic spoils, we are the gift that keeps on giving. Wherever the beat takes us, we will be right there, tapping to the rhythm of love. So go on, share love with us this month of love on Trends Travel.
Welcome back, and thank you very much for staying with us. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has tabled his 2020 budget speech and talking about government activities regarding turning the economy around and intervening where possible to try and fix the state-owned enterprises, as well as assisting small businesses so that they can be sustainable and develop and also create sustainable jobs. So the minister touched on one thing that is very important regarding stopping excessive salaries in public entities, and he said the government will also deal decisively with excessive high cost of leasing government buildings. Other issues that came out of the speech were with regards to fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Now, this is interesting because we've heard in the past year about 8 municipalities in 8 provinces not having clean audits, and only the Western Cape coming out tops. So now he says they will abolish the current wasteful subsistence and travel system, replacing cell phone policy, and of course requiring economy class travel for all domestic flights except for exceptional circumstances. And also he talked about referring matters to authorities for possible investigations where there has been fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So let's get analysis of other issues that came out of the budget. We joined in the studio by head of retail investments at Nedbank, Sisa Sikido, and of course we'll have also investment and chartered accountant Rangani Balati, who is a director at the Chapu Chartered Accountants. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay, let me start with you, Cesar. Well, how did you view the budget in terms of addressing structural reforms in turning the economy around?
Well, Colin, I'll speak from the point of the consumer first. And I'll say I'm happy for the consumer, and I'm talking about the general public within South Africa who are not going to be taxed extra. It's not going to cost you more to live in South Africa. When I look at general expenditure within government, I'm excited, but I'm also a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to that. I'd like to see the how. So the speech around reducing costs currently, because we know that there is no revenue necessarily being generated additional to what we're seeing, because obviously there's less people being taxed, because there's less people working in South Africa. That for me requires a little more planning and downright communication and around the how. How is that going to be implemented?
Mm-hmm. So, Rangani, do you think that it will keep ratings agencies at bay, or rather for them to just keep a hold on acting aggressively on South Africa, given that the economy is in dire straits now?
Thanks, Colin. I think looking at the decisions that really the minister took, he actually went against the norm to say, look, I could actually please the rating agencies, I could please the general public of South Africa, I could please corporates. But what the minister then decided to take, he took a decision that, look, I'm going to take a step here, or a decision that will not necessarily be favoring rating agencies or any of the relevant stakeholders. So I believe that the rating downgrades are actually inevitable. It's something that we can avoid at this stage. So I think it was a bold step then to decide to say, let me go with the long-term growth, and also look at the dealing with inefficiencies in terms of the current processes that we have. So more of a decision that is actually favoring everyone, if you can put it like that, instead of actually trying to please the rating agencies alone.
Do you think it's favoring anyone in a true sense when it comes to local government? I mean, municipalities right now, if you look at infrastructure, roads, water, sewage systems, people are always complaining when you turn on your television or switch on your radio, it's always about shut down.
Yeah, look, in terms of local government, obviously it's a key in terms of our economy, in terms of the way most of the people are actually found. So you need to actually have your local economy, your local government to be sound in terms of its processes and how it's actually working. So that, obviously the national government, we know that it's actually funding most of the local municipalities within the country. There are only few municipalities that can actually afford to probably move themselves forward, which will be your big metros. But in terms of what they've actually allocated, I think it's a fair allocation, looking at the fact that we still need to carry those municipalities from the national budget instead of them relying on themselves or sustaining themselves through their own revenue generation.
Right. So, given that the country is spending more than what it can save, do you think it will bring about a difference for us to have a sovereign wealth fund? From this perspective, I mean, like when you look at the South African society, it's so consumerist, and South Africans have been regarded as a savings. They are a savings poor generation.
I think the sovereign wealth fund needs to be something that is rolled out very carefully. I think it could lead to another SOE debacle that we're seeing. We need to take the learnings from our existing SOE failures, and we need to apply those quite stringently. That being said, as much as we are seen as sort of the worst saving nation, South Africans are also quite savvy around the fact that they need to save. We see these in, I'm sure your mother, my mother, our grandmothers have been in stokvels for all of our lives. People understand that I do need to put something away. And I think if we are making it easier for consumers, for them to save and not to be taxed on their savings with products such as your tax-free savings, etc., it then encourages the South African to say, I will want to put my money away because I know that, you know, at the long term, I'm going to be paying more. I'm going to need to pay more for food. I'm going to need to pay more for fuel. They understand that in the future, I'm going to need more money. But it's the how. If I don't have money now, if I'm tight right now, this is why I said the piece around not increasing VAT or tax for me was actually an amazing thing for the normal consumer in South Africa, because that individual relies on the 1,000, 10,000 rand to make it go further. And if we're taxing it and making them have actually less, there's actually nothing to save. So in the event now that the tax is not increased, what are we then going to do with that little bit of a break that we get?
So now, from what she's saying, the country is not collecting revenue as it should. I mean, in the past, we looked at the 50 billion rand, or rather the 20 billion rand deficit, and that has been concerning regarding if government is not collecting more money, how will it then be able to allocate budgets to social spending? Instead, the government is cutting back.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Colin. So there are actually various ways you actually go about in terms of collecting money. Not just about collecting taxes. They could be actually dealing with inefficiencies in the current system to say, how do I make more from what I currently have already? So what I think the minister has actually done, and the president as well during the SONA, they've actually came with some control measures that says from what we're currently actually having that exist within the system, let's actually put some few control measures that will ensure that there is actually some leakages that are protected, not further leaks that then makes us not collect enough. So if you look at SARS itself, we then have new management, and there's also a new restructuring within the SARS. So that probably could then save on some of the monies that probably we were not collecting enough. And then you also have other measures that they've actually put in place, whereby the Auditor General now having a mandate to actually recover monies directly from the people who are responsible or from the accounting authorities within the state-owned entities or within public sector in itself. So those are some of the measures that will then be able to assist in curbing wasteful expenditure and unauthorized expenditure, thereby actually generating more money, not directly through taxes, but through already the existing systems. And it's actually positive that the minister actually highlighted the fact that they want to actually put more money into the justice system. So we're hoping that by putting more money there, the justice system will be able to then deal with the cases of corruption and fraud within the public sector that will probably close some gaps as well. So I think the direction that has been taken has been a bit of a different one, as opposed to direct collecting taxes to improve, but to say let's close on the loopholes and make sure that we don't have wasteful and unauthorized expenditure.
So when you look at the now factor, I mean, if the country is projected to grow its economy by 0.6%, and in the near term, when you look at the 2 years, there's been projected that it will be at 1%. Earlier, we were having a conversation about whether or not 0.5% will be enough to really show that the government has the mettle to turn this economy around from what he referred to at the beginning of the speech, that, you know, the economy used to grow at 5%, you know, before.
I think to your point around inefficiencies, where there is a lack of organic growth, the focal point must be reducing existing costs. So tightening the taps where taps are open wide currently. That is definitely the starting point. And I think the piece around investment in infrastructure, investment in SMMEs, that is going to also generate growth within, funding of entrepreneurs and starting up small businesses. If we also get the Eskom debacle right, we will see some small businesses actually thriving and not having to close down for a week or two, which actually impacts people and impacts them directly. So my thing is, yes, we start with cost cutting, and then we must focus on growth.
Does it sound like public servants would like to negotiate anything with government, as the government sounds like there is actually something in the cards concerning that?
Well, I don't think that especially in terms of the representative unions that actually represent the public sector or the public servants, they actually don't seem to be willing at all to go into that route of saying, let's have a relook at what we've already agreed on. Because the understanding is that there's a standing agreement which has been signed about 3 years ago. There's 1 more year to go, and there's been agreement to say the wage bill is going to increase by these particular figures based on the levels that are there within the public sector. So the unions will actually be very hard in terms of going back to renegotiate those. The minister has spoken to actually reducing the wage bill over the long term. In terms of the detail, he actually didn't provide that. Probably then what he said was they will actually go back and sit down with the unions. So we know what has really happened in the past when those negotiations actually takes place. They take much longer. There's always the issues of unions always wanting to get something out of it. And if you get anything about the inflation rate, it will always be a sort of a backstep for the Minister of Finance. So, but we're hopeful that the unions will come into party.
Isn't it worrying that the issue of Eskom was not really emphasized in terms of, let's say, for example, they have projected that they're going to post a 20 billion rand loss in their financial year and in the not so coming few months. So if this is actually not reiterated in terms of how they are going to really deal decisively with the highly indebted Eskom, surely this is the backbone of the economy, and if Eskom doesn't get its house right, load shedding will continue to persist. There's going to be a problem with debt servicing from that SOE.
I completely agree with you, Colin. We're in a situation where, as a country, we're spending about 3 times more on Eskom than we did 10 years ago for less electricity. That has, like I mentioned earlier, dire sort of repercussions on small businesses, which has a huge impact on the entire economy. So it goes back to my first point around the how. So we need a proper plan and a strategy. We always talk about this in the private sector. We talk about key performance areas. We talk about KPIs and KPAs. We talk about goal commitment contracts. We need to measure and we need to have goals set. We can't just say in the future this is something that's going to happen, and we need to start measuring people and holding them to account, because they really do need to tighten those tabs.
Right. We're going to take a break now. When we return, what's your feeling regarding GDP figures when they come out, especially now that the sectors like agriculture, manufacturing and mining have been on the downside, but we will give you a chance to talk about that. Well, we are discussing the budget right here, and we're going to take a break. When we return, we continue. Stay with us.
My name is Sakumzi Maqubela. Sakumzi means we are building a home.
We started there, we're Foxy, we got a party, yenze life be easy and simple.
Now every other home is an enterprise and everyone around here is an entrepreneur.
When I went to visit my sister at the guest house, that's where the idea came that I can also start a business like this one.
The experience that I got from Usakumzi, and how you present yourself towards Abba,
Bantu, then my business today is well established.
Hi, I'm Lebu, the owner and founder of Lebu Soweto Backpackers. There was an opportunity of seeing Vilakazi Street developing into what it is today. Through this platform, we were able to bring humanity together.
There is nice life.
Youth empowerment is at the center of what we do.
It kind of opened us to the global community.
We got a good story to tell.
I used to be a waitress at Sakunzi, and I was able to go to school to become an attorney.
So Tina,
Our farm is about sustainability. If the farm is doing well, people are smiling and are doing very well.
When I opened my doors, I inspired others to also open their doors to tourists from around the world. If this is happening in Vilakazi Street, imagine what can happen in your own neighborhood.
Welcome back. We're still analyzing the budgets of Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, and we've got Head of Retail Investments at Nedbank, Sisa Tsikido, as well as Director, or rather the Chartered Accountant Rangani Balati, who is Director at Chapu Chartered Accountants. So we were talking about GDP figures. We have a historical factor of the minus 2.3% that the country experienced, and also the 2.3% where the economy grew, and then the numbers cancelled themselves out. Will the economy remain flat, or are we likely to see some green shoots if we are lucky?
Thanks, Glenn. I think with regard to